We're meeting at the Provo Municipal Council. This is a budget work meeting. 2 p.m. Tuesday, June 13, 2020. Meeting the Municipal Council are being held in hybrid fashion, and its members of the public can view council meeting on Facebook, or they may attend in person at Provo City Hall. I remind participants to limit side conversation with noise when not speaking to minimize the potential for background noises and conversations to pick the recorded and broadcast. Today we have with us Justin Harrison, Brian Jones, Travis Holden, Shannon Ellsworth, Rachel Whipple, myself, Teresa Kay, Wayne Dibley, Wayne Parker. George Hanley is on Zoom. George Hanley is on Zoom. And we have Dixie Holmes and John Borgett.
And council staff.
And us. And we have council staff. Okay. Good night.
And Mayor.
We also have the mayor, Michelle Capusi. The public meeting only the presenter for those invited by the council who speak or ask questions, otherwise invited by the chair. Please wait to speak until called on by the council chair. All right, our first item of business is a training on council meeting procedure. This was presented by Justin Harrison, who is our council executive director, and Brian Jones, our council attorney.
Actually, Brian's going to take the lead on that, but did you want to do it for him?
I'll do that. Dear Father, we're grateful for this lovely day. We're grateful for the weather that we've had this season to keep the flooding from being a huge problem in Provo. We're grateful for all the works of staff and public works and volunteers to help mitigate the flooding issues. We pray that we can be conscientious with this study and discussion of the budget, and that we can always work with the citizens of Provo and in the best interest of them. I would say things and in Jesus Christ, amen.
All right, thank you, Chairman Kay, Chairman Kay, councilors. We wanted to try to be really quick about this so you can get to the substantive stuff about the budget. But staff did want to address a few things about, mainly about motions. And so let me walk you just really quickly through the handout that we have, and then I'll make a couple of comments about it. So the handout that we circulated, this first page with sample motions on it, this is actually in the chair notes document that we received every council meeting. So we just wanted to call your attention, make sure everybody knew that it was there, and then you can use it in any meeting. The next page is an excerpt from the handbook that directly talks about motions. I wanted to mention one thing specifically on this, a couple of bullet points. One is halfway down the page, it says secondary amendments or second degree, which amend an amendment are allowed, but third degree amendments are not allowed. So what that means is if somebody makes a motion and somebody else makes a motion to amend the original motion, you can't have one more motion to amend the amendment, but you can't have a motion to amend the amendment to the amendment to the first motion. That has
you can amend the amendment.
You can amend
That's fine.
That's fine. That's the last we do, right? And the next bullet, and this is the other reason why I brought it up, is the second to last bullet point says there can only be 3 motions on the floor of this thing. Once we get to the point where we've got 3 motions, we have to start resolving more motions. So, and again, that's very rare that happens. And the typical way that it happens is that there's a main motion and then either a motion to amend or a motion to substitute, and then a third one. So you might have a motion to send something to committee, and somebody might say, I make a substitute motion, and you just ask them for a report instead of sending it to committee. And then you may have an amended motion to send it to the mayor to ask for a report by X date, right? And at that point, you've got 3 motions on the floor, and there's one of each kind, and you start working backwards to actually resolve it. And that amendment and substitution could go the other way. Somebody could amend the main motion, and somebody else, I don't like any of that, I'm going to do a complete substitute, right? But again, the general rule is that we are trying to have 3 things a maximum of 3 things on that.
But if someone seconds the first one, that has to be like follow through.
Each motion that you make has to be seconded before you even do anything at all. And then you work your way back to until you've got the decision. Right? So if a substitute motion passes, that resolves the whole issue. The main motion goes away. The substitute motion is not passed.
You can do a substitute motion after a second of the first one.
Yeah,
You can't do it after, without a second.
right. Right. If the first motion hasn't been seconded, you can't even make a motion to amend it or to substitute it because the first motion doesn't even really exist yet. Right? It's just an idea until it's seconded. So, and then there's the next part of the handout, the next 2 pages, well, the next 3 pages are actually out of an appendix that's in the council handbook. That's kind of, that we put it here for easy reference. And it's kind of some simplified practice points about Robert's rules and the rules of order that the council follows. Now, having said all that, the reason why we wanted to bring this up is staff, and particularly in trying to do the minutes, we've had some difficulties recently with kind of 2 issues that have led to some of the motions being unclear or staff having questions about their clarity. And the 2 things that we've noticed happening, one of them is probably really easy to fix. One of them is this recommending that the best practice is always to restate the motion immediately before voting, right? Because sometimes there'll be a long conversation about a motion, and then we call for a vote, and it can sometimes be unclear to staff whether all of that conversation affected the motion or not. And sometimes it can actually be even confusing to councilors themselves about what they're really voting on. So one of our practice tips would just be, we would encourage you to always, when it's time to say the vote, unless you made the motion and there's no discussion, right? But if there's a motion and there's discussion, say, okay, would you restate your motion to whoever made it and then vote on it? Which will actually help with the other issue. The other issue that we've noticed is a melting pot, a soup recipe method of making motions. There's kind of this tendency to kind of make motions as a group, where one person will say, well, I make a motion, and then somebody else will say, well, does your motion include this? And then somebody else says, well, I would like the motion. I'm okay with that if it also includes this. And at times it can become unclear to staff whether those things are actually modifying the motion or not. And so what we'd like to recommend, and I don't want to be, we want to be flexible at the same time that we're having good protocols. So we're not trying to impose hard and fast rules. What we'd like to recommend is that, generally speaking, that first, if you're still in the formative stages where you're not even sure what your motion is, you have an idea, but you're not really sure yet, we would recommend that instead of actually making a motion and then fleshing it out through the group discussion, say, I'm thinking that what we ought to do is, what do you think about that? And have the discussion just about the idea instead of necessarily having a discussion about the motion, until you actually feel pretty confident in your own mind that you know what the motion is that you want to make. And at that point, make it. And then at that point, if somebody else says, well, does that include this? I would encourage you to say, yeah, did it include that? What was that my intent? And they're just having a helpful clarification. And if it is, say, yes, that was my intent. Thank you for the clarification. Does the second still stand, right? And if it's something that actually you haven't thought about before, or especially if it's something that you're not even sure that you necessarily agree with or feel comfortable with, the best thing to do would be to say, well, that wasn't my intent, but you're welcome to make a motion to amend, to add that if that's what you want, right? And then the person can make that motion to amend. We can have discussion on the motion to amend, and if it gets approved, then it's clear to everybody what it is. You know, Elizabeth wanted me to just throw out and say, she thinks that sometimes maybe the formality of that seems confusing. It's actually much more clear for her to have a string of amended and substitute motions that results in the final product than just a group discussion that he's not sure how many council members agree with each point of the group discussion. So that's just something that we wanted to raise, and I have to answer any questions. That was all we had.
Well, these are mostly my faults.
Well, no, and Justin and I will try to help too, and Elizabeth will try to let us know when she's not clear on something. And so it's something that cycles through, all the time. Where there's kind of a balance. There's a balance between formality and flexibility, and the pendulum kind of swings back and forth. And so we just wanted to have that discussion.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, for me, I think I want to try to start writing them down so I can do like an outline format, like, okay, here we are on our motion. And then if I've got a substitute, I can indent it in. And then I can know we've got to take care of this one first, and then we go back out, and then we go back out.
Right.
I think I need the visual.
Yeah. And Elizabeth takes very copious notes where she's kind of doing the same thing, and it works for her when they are actually substitute and amended motions. What's hard for her is when it turns into this kind of back and forth question and answer session about what's really included or not. And that's why I say, let's try to the extent we can, let's try to make that simple and just say, if that is a helpful clarification, say, yes, that's part of my motion. And if it's not, say, I hadn't thought about that, and leave it up to somebody to make a formal motion, instead of kind of piecing together the recipe of the motion.
Because we definitely do that a lot. All right. So I will try to do better about writing things so I understand where we are. But it's okay to clarify the motion, that's not amending it, and then we restate it at the end. Or if through the discussion, it turns out we want something different, then we ask for the amended motion.
Right.
And then we get the amended motion out of the way, and then we back ourselves back up and out.
Exactly.
Like going into a tunnel.
Yes. Well, that's part of the flexibility. And I didn't want this to come, we talked about this internally, and I didn't want this to come across as you're not allowed to ask for clarifications. You have to do everything through amended motions. We don't want that level of flexibility, but we do need to be careful that the clarifications don't lead to a lengthy discussion and makes it ambiguous with motion action.
To piggyback on what Ryan said and kind of to go in an opposite direction. That's not to say if you're not clear what you want the motion to be, go ahead and make the motion. Maybe you don't need that discussion. Maybe you're very clear in what you want that direction. Don't feel that it's necessary to have unneeded discussion if you want to make a motion at whatever time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you, because I think there's also, because of the collegiality and the effort to kind of come to consensus on things, I think there's sometimes an impulse to try to talk somebody else into including the things you want in the motion. And it may be that in many instances, it's better to just say, well, I don't know whether you were thinking about this or not, but I think we ought to do this. So I move to amend the motion to do X, Y, and Z, and then just have the discussion on the amended motion, and you get a clear vote one way or another on what the majority of the council thinks about that. But there are competing interests here, so I'm not giving you black light. Sorry.
And if we vote on the amended motion after that, then we don't have to go back to the original motion.
Well, you do. That's the difference between an amendment and a substitution, right? So if I, to use the example that I used before, if I move to send something to committee, a substitute motion would be, I don't want it to go to committee. I want Public Works to bring me a report on it. If that one passes, the main motion has gone away, right? An amended motion would be, I like the idea that it's going to committee, but I want the committee to have citizen input instead of just council members. So I move to amend the motion to say that if it goes to committee, that citizens be invited to participate. If that motion passes, all that does is amend the original motion by adding the citizen input part, and you still need to vote on the main motion, which is now send it to committee with citizen input. That makes sense.
Thank you. I feel silly asking, but it helps.
I think too, that part of it is we have a new staff member who's gonna be coming in my role, and so to the extent that we can simplify the process, that will help them in their new learning curve.
Yeah, anything else on that?
On to the fun stuff.
Okay. All right, next, a discussion regarding unencumbered ARPA funds, and this was presented by Justin Harrison, Council Executive Director.
All right. Thank you, Chair McKay. Just some quick background. The council, in November, at their November 1st meeting of last year, appropriated kind of the last tranche of ARPA dollars that the city had available, and that included just over $57,000 for water conservation. In the last few weeks, you may or may not have seen that with the impending debt ceiling, the federal government was throwing all kinds of things out there in order to raise the debt limit. And one of those things that made it into the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023 was this idea of rescinding certain unobligated funds that were provided for COVID-19. Now, that's very ambiguous language, and there haven't been additional details. But one of the ideas was clawing back some of those dollars to localities, or cities, counties, states. We don't have any additional details on those rules yet. However, we thought it would be prudent to at least have the conversation about dollars that weren't encumbered, but had been appropriated to the general fund for a certain purpose. Go from there. Not sure if there's interest in doing something specific with those dollars, or
Well, probably most prudent to do something with those dollars. Specifically. Now, when you say unencumbered, definition wise, does that mean that they can be spent, or that they can just be dedicated to something waiting to be spent? Like specific something, not just water conservation, but.
sure. Yeah. So long as it's a specific something waiting to be spent, I think we are safe. Again, they haven't come up with specific rules, which again isn't helpful for cities and states across the country. But I think that puts us in a much better place than having them just sitting in a general fund or an account waiting to be put forward or allocated for a specific use.
So any discussion on this?
I would like to see the funds used for water conservation.
So what specifically?
Yeah, so I have some ideas. I'm not sure what would be most efficient, right? Because we haven't gone to this level of detail. I do get messages from citizens, and I see it myself when the sprinklers are on in city parks and it's raining. So if we could use this money for water controllers, if we don't have them, again, I haven't done any research on what's possible here, but if we don't have smart controllers in parks to prevent sprinkling irrigation when it's raining, that would be, I think, a good use. Alternatively, we could use it to flip some of the city's strips, right? So right out here front on Center Street, there's like 18 inches of turf, and the water sprays 4 or 5 feet.
Well, that was one of the things that not get funded, was flipping the Center Street and stuff, right? What was the number? 70,000. Okay, there you go.
Pretty
You want to
close.
put that toward that?
Pretty close.
So that would be given to Parks and Rec to go towards that. Is that Parks and Rec who would do this?
Yeah, we do Center Street. I guess I would also want to know what the cost and benefit would be put to implementing smart controllers at the city parks. Do we have any idea?
No.
The vast majority of them are on smart controllers. So I have to look at that.
There's a big difference between rain too, like I have a
Yes.
smart controller, and rain doesn't necessarily negate the fact to have the water.
But sometimes we've overseeded or have new sod in the parks, and we get a lot of, concern about that. And people just have to kind of check into why it's happening the way it is. But there are probably some of the older parks that may not have smart controllers, but we could, and if you'd like, we could have parks come talk about their dirt management, irrigation, all of that stuff.
What's the urgency of this? Like, isn't it rather urgent? Like,
It's as fast as the federal government's gonna move, so that's,
Well, I can reshare, John has some insights as well, but we've talked to congressional staff, and everything that we've heard from them is clawing it back from federal agencies. They said if a check's been written to a locality, there's no interest in coming back and trying to probably those dollars out. If you miss the deadlines, they will definitely come back and have a conversation with you about your ARPA funds. But when they talk about a clawback as part of the debt ceiling discussion, it was all about federal agencies that got allocated and had not covered them. But from their perspective, if they wrote a check to us, those funds would be covered and go on through the federal system.
Did they write a check to us?
Yes.
What's that?
Yeah, they wrote
Yes,
a check to us.
checks are all here.
all right, so would it make sense
You'd
then?
have to pay a little place of cash there, right?
To plan a
Yeah,
work,
look at that.
plan a work meeting where Parks and Rec can discuss the best use of $55,000 towards water conservation in Parks and Rec.
I think we just get more information. If there's like these smaller projects, I just want to kind of refine the scope. of what
Right,
we're looking at.
so flip the strip center street or smart controllers.
Yeah, we can invite them to come to work.
Can you make a motion on that?
Well, I think this is good because before we just said water conservation generally, and we were waiting for water conservation plan and stuff like that. And Public Works figured out a way to do it where we don't need these funds for it. And because they have done that, we now have the opportunity to be more specific about how we allocate this. That's good.
It is good.
Make a motion?
we can,
I don't think we need it.
Okay.
yeah, and we can definitely bring it back. We can also, we've talked a little bit with finance about bringing back an item just to do a review of ARPA funds, kind of where projects stand at this point. So we can roll that all into one if that's. Okay.
So after we have that presentation, if we decide that we do want it to go toward a street or something, will we need to do a motion or something in order to get that in the budget properly? And
It's not appropriate, I understand.
wait,
Or was it?
It was,
Wasn't there other like?
We'll need to use it.
yeah, it's just appropriate to the general fund.
Kind of,
Or something else?
there's a legacy CIP. But there's not any, but that's sitting there in a fund that you can appropriate at any time, but there's no like rush.
no, we don't.
Is that, but that's CA? No, is that separate from ARPA? That's a previous term.
It was, yes.
Yeah.
There was something else we did last year that's sitting there because we didn't appropriate it. What was that?
There's $1 million we haven't used for instance.
No. I can't remember.
If you remember, let us know, because I need to meet with
It came up in our last,
And we don't have to worry about any of the ARPA funds that are going for business or any of those things. They're not going to get clawed back. They're safe. So, yeah. I just want to make sure the money has been told we still have.
Yes, you still have.
all right, next, a presentation regarding the 2024 tentative budget amendments. This will be presented by Elsie Zarrock, our budget. Where do you want me? Sitting, standing?
Wherever you would like.
There's like a
Take the podium.
situation.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kelsey with Finance. And we just wanted to go through some changes to the tentative budget. There's nothing crazy that we've found, but we wanted to make you aware of any changes so that way, when it comes time to adopt the final budget or the tentative budget amendments, that you'll know exactly what's been changing. So I'm just going to run through each line because at the very bottom of the page, like there's a bunch of lines together and that's just for one thing. So it's really not as overwhelming as it might have looked when you got this information. So just starting in the general fund, There have been a few changes in general services and the council, and just a few departments that were affected by a chargeback change. So in general services specifically, we increased the expense budget for a vehicle loan payment to cover a 24 payment for a fire vehicle. This is something we brought to work meeting last week. And so if you don't approve that, then we would take that out of the tentative budget. But we've just put it there as a placeholder so we don't forget about it if it does go forward. So that was that first line. The next line, there was a $21,000 transfer from the airport fund to the general fund that was originally built into the budget. But after we discussed the interfund interest for the airport in work meeting last week, we double checked to make sure that the interest was built into the budget for next year. It was, but we had looked, when we budgeted for it, it was at a 4.5% interest rate. And we thought to be safe, we wanted to go with 5%. And so that was almost the exact amount of the transfer to the general fund. So we took that out of the transfer and put it into the interfund interest line. So hopefully it won't be a problem next year. This is a new thing, the third line, we had to decrease property tax revenue for fiscal year 24. Originally, we got certified tax rates from the county last Thursday, and we thought we actually got a $20,000 bump. But we found out that they had made another adjustment on Friday, which is final, so they're not changing it anymore. But it actually ended up decreasing our property tax revenue, and so we had to lower that revenue amount in the general fund by $50,000. And then just to kind of help compensate, we've increased miscellaneous revenue budget by $135,000. That's not unprecedented. We've had budget years where miscellaneous revenue has been as high as maybe $400,000, and that change doesn't bring us up to that level. But it is where we balance the budget in the general fund. There are a few other areas that went into that balancing aspect, and this line right here is for the council staff, and there just been a miscommunication about bringing over budget that lines that don't change from year to year. We had put some zeros in instead of putting in the same amount from the year before into some council accounts. And so we just wanted to make sure we get full budget. And so that's what the change is there. It's a correction of $44,000. And then finally, we'll get to this in a minute, but the general fund was impacted by an increase to the employee benefits chargeback, about $5,000, $6,000 across the whole general fund. I didn't break it out because I mean some of the amounts are like $19 depending on the division. And so that was also a general fund impact. So that takes care of the general fund. Do you have any questions about those items? I'm happy to address them before going into other funds.
Yeah, I just want to go, so we finally have our numbers from the county.
Yes,
And we are getting less from them than we had anticipated.
exactly.
Yeah, because of the way they've done the certified tax rate.
The property valuations had dropped a little bit, and just even like tweaking the rate a tiny bit can just adjust your numbers by the amounts that we saw. So, I mean, originally we thought we had gained a little bit, but then we ended up dropping a little bit. So, yeah, we wish it had been the Thursday news though, instead of what we heard today. So, any other questions? Okay, we'll go down. So fleet, we just had a few adjustments to revenue for fleet. We increased it based on vehicle loan payments for the fire truck, and then also vehicle and facilities that we needed to add a payment for in fiscal year 24. So fleet gets some revenue, which you'll see reflected in some of the expense side on some other levels, like facilities is the next one. And so we increased their expense budget for that vehicle loan payment by the same amount that we increased fleet's revenue for that same vehicle. Library, when we got the certified tax rate back for library, it actually increased their property tax by $59,000. So they got a little bit of a bump compared to what was budgeted. The airport, I already talked about how we got rid of the transfer to the general fund and replaced it with interest expense. And so that's what the airport line is showing. I don't know how you can see this screen, but it was just reducing transfer out and increasing interfund interest expense in the airport by the $21,000. Golf, this has to do with the appropriation interfund loan that you approved last week for the golf cart storage shed. We wanted to make sure we budgeted for the interest expense for that loan. And then we also reduced their overall capital expense budget to cover the principal payment and the interest expense payment for the golf car storage shed. So some of these are just very hot off the press changes that we made based on some of the council action recently taken. The parks VIP, that's the fund that is loaning money for the golf storage shed. So we budgeted interest expense for the parks VIP at $19,000 there. So they're getting revenue. And then energy, I just noticed when going through the budget that we had missed a chargeback for them, that it just wasn't linking correctly. So I just increased their budget for facilities chargeback by $9,000 just to make sure it was accurate with what the intent had been. The very last item is employee benefits. What happened is there was an increase to background check costs, and so that went up by $10,000. So we increased the expense budget for those background checks by $10,000. We increased the revenue budget by $10,000, and the revenue is coming from the rest of the city. And so this is a breakdown of all the funds that are paying for that background check increase. And the general fund, I just listed at the top since I can show you the total $10,000 down there, but I had also listed it with the general fund changes at the top. So those are the changes to the tentative budget. I'm happy to answer any more questions, but hopefully things are making sense and there are no surprises there. Any questions?
Thanks, Kelsey.
Yeah.
Questions?
Normally, when you have a $10,000 additional expense, would we try to allocate that evenly and bring it all from chargeback expenses, or is there always a general fund element to your costs that we hadn't anticipated?
Well, so the general fund, like there's a chargeback to general services and a few of the like finance, just any division we calculate into the formula. And so it's just the general fund division portion of the chargeback impact right there.
So it is split across.
It is split, yeah. And so that's just, I just summed them all up into one fund because it would have made the 2 pages long. There we go. Anyone else? Any questions?
Yeah, just in general, so early on you said, okay, we had the shortfall because taxes changed
Yeah.
and like my personal budget, I would love to be able to just say like, oh, well, I'll make it up somewhere.
Right.
But isn't that basically what we just said is like, well, we'll find a way to cover that shortfall. I mean, we were balanced and we were out of balance and we're like, we'll just beef this one up. So in the past, have we been able to do that? I mean, do we underestimate in that area, in that miscellaneous area, so that if something like this comes up, we can do that? How do we have to proactively figure out a way to get more miscellaneous, or what do we do?
So miscellaneous, it really is miscellaneous. Some years we get a lot, some years we don't get as much. I know that this year when we were budgeting revenues, there were times where it was tempting to use miscellaneous balance budget early on, but I know that if we did and we found some revenue that could make up for it, we would take it back out of miscellaneous to just try to keep it from getting overinflated. Sometimes we're able to find revenues in other areas that can help too.
Last minute like this though, it's like, look, we really want to balance the budget, we want to be able to say we balance the budget, we'll find a way to make it up type of thing.
Yeah. Yes, John has a comment.
And I would add to that we really focus on trying to never use miscellaneous to balance.
Yeah.
Until we get to the very end. The other thing that we don't like to do is go in and adjust, for example, sales tax, because we use some logic and methodology that went behind it. And so we try to just watch that and be very careful. And we never get to a situation when we're in the middle of the budget process, saying, oh, let's go ahead and increase this line.
Yeah.
More.
Right.
So we try to watch it a little carefully.
Yes.
Let me understand why the county would have one
Yes.
budget going up and one going down.
We had the same question, like, what is this about? So I talked to the county today on the phone to just figure this out. And it was kind of interesting. I got a little pushback at first when I was questioning whether the rates had changed since Thursday, until there was the kind of aha moment of, oh, actually, Provo's did change on Friday because it had to do with their redevelopment valuations. I think he had mentioned something about the state tax commission having some updates, and then he had to input some information on Friday that related to the redevelopment aspect of Provo. And so that's what lowered our property valuation and then affected the rates. And so typically, I don't think that it's normal that the rates would change after they're published the first day. He said that they're solid going here on out, like they're not changing after today or technically after Friday. We had just looked on Friday and didn't realize until today that there was a difference, so.
But how would the assumption for two different budgets be different?
For two
As far as
different budgets.
directionally, so like the libraries, all of a sudden we underestimated for the library, but we overestimated for the city.
Oh,
I guess I would expect both of them to move the same direction.
right.
We get a read.
Well, and when we originally had the Thursday numbers, the city, the general obligation, not general obligation, general operations, property tax had increased by about 20,000 and the libraries had increased by about 108,000. But then when we got the new numbers today, libraries down to 60,000 in the city. So they both went down.
Yeah.
Library just,
So directionally, they both.
yeah,
adjust
they did,
downward.
exactly. So anyway. Other questions on these changes?
Do we need to actually understand the reason why they changed it?
The state or the county? I'm sure we can get a better explanation. I mean, I know that it had to do with redevelopment valuations and I was like, well, I know that, and they said because we have a redevelopment agency that affects Provo as opposed to other municipalities that don't, they wouldn't have had to change. And that's about the extent of my understanding of it, and I'm happy to get more information for you.
As we're looking at working on our redevelopment agency and our board, it would probably be useful to know how this would interact with the capital valuations in the future. This is good. I know nothing about this. This is very confusing to me right now.
Yeah, I have a contact over there at the county and I can just say, can you walk me through this a little bit more and I can get you a better explanation through email or next week at a council meeting, whatever works.
Yeah, well, what do you think, Shannon, as from the REA stuff? Are you interested in this too?
I am, there's a report that has to come, that's required to come to state law to county on property values for our new areas. And it's supposed to be, this is deadline in state law. April 1st. And I asked staff for it weeks ago, and they pulled it from the county, so we have that. But then there's other reports that came through the creative stuff. And I think a lot of cities do report it is. What, or not,
No. No, I'm fascinated by this idea that they would blame the RDA for changing their valuation for us from one day to another.
And I can get clarification. That might have been my interpretation of what he said. I don't know if that's exactly what it is. So I will definitely double check on that.
Yeah.
I was just relieved to hear that the rates weren't going to be changing again because I was like, well, I'd be okay if they might have helped us, revenue wise, but I didn't want them to go down anymore. So
Yeah.
that was kind of my main takeaway. And I can get a little more clarification on this other element of like, why was it updated on Friday again? I think there are some different deadlines with the county this year that aren't typically a factor. And so it sounded like there had been some shuffling and some things going on that aren't normal. So I'll double check on that.
Okay. Yeah. In the meantime, we don't need that. We're going forward with the budget because we have good numbers now.
Yeah, he was 100% confident. He said they're solid. He was very adamant. So I totally trust that. And he's been very reliable to work with in the past. So great. Thank you.
Kelsey, you can just follow up with us with the email.
Yeah. Okay, we'll do that. Okay.
I have one more question. So if the library was looking at a budget before we got the updated numbers from property taxes, they exceeded $100,000 of money that they didn't expect. And they're asking for a $100,000 increase based on the property tax change this year. Did that change anybody? Did the finance kind of sit down and say, okay, library was asking for $100,000 more. There's going to be $100,000 more in revenue. The updated number is not quite 100,000, but it was. Does that change a discussion about truth in taxation and a request that was made when that budget changed by approximately what they had been asking for in the positive?
I will say, like, for the library's budget this year, because I'm pretty sure we plugged in the property tax estimate number for their budget. They gave us their expenses, but weren't sure about property tax. And we left library's property tax flat because we didn't want them to we didn't want to have their fund balance like cover more than what was anticipated. And because of that, this bump is actually helpful to them in that sense, because we weren't really anticipating for growth. We didn't budget for that. In terms of looking at reevaluating their property tax, I haven't looked at it. I don't know if anyone else in finance has considered that at this point, or if library has. I don't even know if library knows yet what the increase is to their property tax rate. Don?
Yeah, my feeling is the concern with the library board and also from administration with the city has been the trend. You know, there's been a trend with it's not keeping up with inflation, and so this may have given them one tiny little bit of a shock, but that doesn't change the trend of where we're headed based on the way that the property tax works within the state of Utah and the fact that their level can only increase based on growth. So I don't think it changes anything, but it does help a little bit.
Thanks, Kelsey.
Yeah, and if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us about these changes.
Great, and we'll look forward to your email.
Okay,
All right, now we're gonna have a discussion regarding property tax. This will be presented by Justin Harrison.
All right. I have the slides from what we went over last week in the work meeting. Happy to go through them again if that is desired, or happy to jump right into some of the spreadsheets that we were going over towards the tail end and get right to a discussion. So I don't know if there's a direction you'd like to go. Nothing?
We've all seen this thing, we had it presented to us.
Yep.
So I think we should open it to discussion. You want to put it on the page where it was kind of our options? I think it was the different percentages. Should we talk about now, is the library going to be separate? Yeah.
We
Yeah,
can
do the library or the general operations first.
Yeah, we've got a couple of different spreadsheets, one for each.
Okay,
So
let's go, it's all in this discussion.
Yep.
Okay,
Why don't we review them real quick?
Okay.
Like, let's not go through the whole presentation, but just hit the highlights real quick.
So
Like just the amounts for
The amounts.
the library and the different amounts for the general.
we have I have it. So, as was mentioned, the recommendation from the library board was $100,000 increase each year over the next 5 years. With the updated numbers from the county, the Kelsey just reviewed, see that they're just shy of about $60,000 in additional revenue. So these rates were based off of valuations from last year. They're roughly the same now. We can jump over that for really late, but you can see $100,000 increase looks like just over, or just about $2.60 a year for the average home in Provo. For $250,000 in additional revenue, you're looking at just shy of $6.50, and for $500,000, just about $13.
Sorry, dumb question, and this would require truth and taxation as well, and it would just these would all fall under the same umbrella tax, so to speak.
Correct.
Can I add a comment? So, I am like council liaison for the library board, I'm supportive of, appropriately reducing the trend of, overextending themselves. It's a unique building. We don't really have a structure like this in the city's overall portfolio that's this age and this kind of general liability. I have recommended to the library director that we do like a facilities plan, because they need to fix the roof, they need to fix the bricks, they need to fix the parking lot. There's a lot of structural, physical facilities elements, and I think that they need to organize that. And I'm sure that they'll spend the money appropriately, but I think it's important to understand what those physical liabilities are and time them and sequence them and make sure that we're appropriately taking care of this unique asset. So that was my recommendation to the director of the library.
Well, that's really helpful. Along those same lines, did they have a recommendation of where they spend this fund specifically?
There was, John, I don't know if you get a specific, I'm trying to remember.
Long-term concerns are around facilities, like huge HVAC issues, huge roofing and brick issues, parking lot issues, all of them are valid.
Right, but I'm saying they're asking us for rate taxes.
Mhm.
They want 100K, 200K, 300K, whatever. Have they told us where that's going to go specifically? Like I know with the other one, we talked about the police officer, right? So we have kind of something in mind.
The
I would
director,
hate to write it just a blank check. I know.
when the director presented on this, it wasn't about any kind of expansion plan at all. It was about saying, we're using general reserves every single day.
That's right, that's
for
right.
Basic maintenance of this property, and we're trying to stop the acceleration of this. So it's not exciting, because it's not about some new, it's not new FTE, it's not, it's just to stop
Yeah.
this reduction in their general fund, basically, the reserve account.
That's right, I remember that.
So that they have the money for capital improvements, but
They need it now, yeah. I mean,
That's what I was saying, so.
it's just, yeah. They're not even trying to like, how do I say this? They have been saving, they have been conscientious, but it's just not right.
Can I ask a question? Which one is the closest to a cost of living increase? The 100,000?
Well, the most recent CPI that just came in yesterday or today was 4%
The last 4 months.
for the last 12 months. That's common. Last 12 months. was that.
So which one of these is 4% for them?
So George, their ask was, as opposed to a percentage, their ask was a dollar figure of $100,000 in additional revenue each year over the next 5 years. Here is,
I think what George is asking is, what does that equate to in percentage terms for the average person, right? If my property tax go up $2.57 or 62 cents, whatever it is.
Well, no. Yeah, actually, what I'm asking is whether or not, if we understand that their budget is decreasing because of cost of living, is $100,000 the equivalent of that decrease in 1 year? I'm assuming it is because that's what they're asking for, but I don't know.
The 3.75. So 4% of that, if you're gonna go up the last 12 months, talking about 200,000 approximately. 150,000, excuse me.
So they're asking below what the cost of living, I'm assuming they're trying to be very modest here and say we don't want to cause too much alarm, but we need to stop the bleeding, and so we're going to ask for this amount, but that it's below 4% of their budget or below 4% of their costs.
And the expectation could be that they don't expect inflation to stay at this rate for the next 5 years. I'm not sure. But yeah, I think they're trying to be very conservative about it.
But the other issue is if we just do the lower amount, do the $100,000 this year, then we would need to do it again next year and again the next and again the next for 5 years. So
Yeah, I understand that. And that's in addition, that's in addition to what we're also considering on our end, right?
yes.
I mean, one of the questions I had in our last discussion, but one of the points that was made is that obviously we can't commit any kind of future council to agree to this going forward. So the reason I asked Carla in our last discussion, how much would we need to do up front to basically pre-fund what her expectation need is over the next 5 years is because there's the real risk that we get to next year and nobody ever approves going forward. No other council over the next 4 years approves any kind of truth in taxation, right? So then they're just back to, this budget that's going backwards. And that they could sustain that. I mean, they've got the $2 million, excess fund. They've got some reserve. I mean, they could dig into this for, 5 or 7 years until it was gone. And then be forced to come to the council, and say, look, we're out of money, we have no money, we have to bond to even keep the library open. But I think they're trying to get ahead of that. But when I asked Carla if she thought that the 250, which is kind of that mid-range number, would be sufficient if we did that all at once, me thinking you've got some, time value of money working for you, right? If you get 5% on the excess amount that you raised beyond what you said you needed, and then not have to come back for truth and taxation next 5 years. Her comment to me in that meeting was that wouldn't be sufficient. So I don't know where the
So
number
even
is.
then, she's still gonna be short.
I don't know where.
Generally, you'd be in favor of front loading it.
Yeah, if it took away the risk of being underfunded.
Yeah.
And that was because, John, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm trying to remember Carlos' answer. The ask was for 500, but the actual delta that they were missing was closer to 7. Is that correct?
Or 700,000 they need.
Yes.
I didn't remember that. I thought they were saying that they needed 500.
Okay. I'm trying to remember back to your comments.
Well, and unlike the last year, we had the citizens got hit with the property tax increase from the school board and our increase, and of course we had some citizens come to our meetings who weren't clear on the distinction, and the deciding body who was making that decision. But in this case, even though it's for the library, this and our other contemplated tax increase is our decision, and it will be understood by citizens as a lump sum, right? So what if we decided for $6.56 per household, but then we're adding our own increase that was to keep pace with cost of living, then together we got to be thinking about what that number looks like. And maybe that was discussed at some length earlier, but that's just something that I'm keeping in mind. I'm very sympathetic to wanting to help them keep pace. They're dealing with the same thing we're dealing with. The school board is dealing with the same thing, and I do believe if we don't do anything, we make it more costly down the road rather than less.
So what do today we're trying to determine what rate we would agree on? If we want to raise taxes and what,
Yeah.
what degree?
Now, doesn't the library come out as its own line? It does, yes. So George, just to clarify, there would be a city line and a library line on the taxes.
But we're the same, yeah, that's correct, but we're the same deciding body. That's all I was trying to point out.
On your property tax bill, just show the one line.
But in the budget ordinance.
But in the budget order, it shows.
In the mailer that you get that says the Provo City Council will meet on this day to determine, is that two separate lines or one line?
I think that would show, I believe, I'm not sure, but I think that would show the separate, but on your property tax bill, you get from the county pay, it just has, yeah.
I think last year people most noticed that mailer and the bar, or not the bar,
By the way, $100,000 it would be, it's 2.7%, and the percentage based on $100,000.
And last year we increased, general taxes by
2.9.
So back to my point about kind of risking that future councils will not fund this going forward. I'm less worried about the library being defunded than I am actually the other side of the conversation that we have, which is, about public safety and about other increases of places. I do think it'd be an easier conversation to have as a council if the library was going to somehow, close its doors or something like that, or fall apart. I think it's easier for a council to say, well, we need to it's a separate line item. We haven't been transferring as a city, general funding over, it's a separate thing, it's separately funded, and we just need to increase that funding source. So while it is a risk, it's probably not a big risk that future councils will fund the library.
And I like the idea of being more proactive and prudent and never getting to a crisis point. That seems to be more responsible, and people get really mad at us if we've got buildings falling apart and say, we have to do this right now. Like, well, where were you the last 10 years?
Well, Dave, did I understand that? Was I reading between the lines? If you had to choose one or the other, you would support funding something that was focused more so on public safety. Did I misunderstand that?
Yeah, I wasn't, I don't think I was talking about the two in conjunction with each other. I just think for future councils, I think it'd be easier as a council to not fund our truth and our expectation that we're making some kind of inflationary adjustment for public safety, even though public safety is so important. I think the average citizen would say, we'll just take it from somewhere else.
So you're saying,
But it's a library, it's different. Yeah, they don't have somewhere else to take it from. Like, this is their only funding source.
And fees.
Yeah. It's almost.
I pay my fair share.
You should. Their budget, everything they derive revenue from, the rentals, the fees, everything is just a minuscule line item relative to property taxes.
Even if they were to double prices, they still
make it through.
And it's not necessarily their mission. It's not always like, aligned with the mission of the library.
Right. I get that.
Okay, so this is the 250. Look at the slide again, it has all three options.
So look, that actually is the older numbers. I'll click through here and make it a little, they've changed slightly. So at the bottom, these tabs, these 2022, that's based off the 2022 valuations that we had last week. These 2023 tabs are now with
Oh,
the
okay.
updated valuation that we just got from.
So the 100,000 is 262 for the federal.
And we can change any number you want. We can.
And what was the one with the 500,000?
500,000. The 1312.
And see, I guess this is me just, I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking this, but the 500,000 on the once is overfunded. It was way beyond board's request because we're saying you've got way more than you asked for the first 2 or 3 years. And plus you get interest on that money. And plus after 5 years, you'll be at the tax rate that you've been asked us for to be at after 5 years. Does that make sense? So there's all these, I mean, I think if we're going to pre-fund it, we would be pre-funding it at a level below 500. And still accomplishing the total ask that the board was asking.
So is your interest to just go with 250, or do you want to make a new number that would equate with 500,000?
It sounds like it's 250, it's obviously something above 250, but
Yeah, so you want to find that number?
seems like it'd be pretty easy to. So we make some kind of estimate on interest on the. Well, we have to make assumptions. We have to make an assumption that they can get
Do you
measured.
not need to- I have for-
There's some analysis that needs to be done. Do we have to make the decision today, or can we come up with a couple of intermediate alternatives?
My expectation is that we vote to go into truth and taxation for the other department anyway. Does it obligate us when we ask for truth and taxation? Are we at that moment committing to a certain percentage?
So you're committing to a certain max percentage. You have to provide notice for the highest rate that you would raise it. But otherwise, you don't have to commit, but you're not committing yourself to a certain number. You have to put a number in the proposal and you can't approve something higher.
And do we need to put in two numbers, the number we do for the library portion and the number for us?
So we need to do that number in our motion to do truth and taxation?
Well, it could be two separate motions, and Kelsey and John may have, they have different
interests in this than I do from the legal standpoint and from the staff standpoint about preparing for next Tuesday's meeting. The thing I most want to know is whether there is a consensus from the council on doing truth in taxation at all, because it drastically affects the version of the ordinance that we would bring. The short version and the long version are drastically different. And then I don't personally care whether you're filling in the numbers today or next Tuesday, but it probably makes it easier for finance to give a number today. Kelsey has her hand.
I will say, I'm pretty sure we need to alert the county if there's an intent to do taxation by June 22nd, and I'm pretty sure they need the exact number by June 30th at the latest. So
That cap.
But it's the.
that's the cash. So anyway, we do need to know numbers.
We would want the number by next Tuesday, but I'm not personally that concerned if you don't know the number today, as long as you let us know if you intend to do truth in taxation. Which isn't to say that you're bound by that either. I think I was trying to find that Tuesday. Come up with the longer version of this, but that's, I think, the key decision today. And then the more you know, the more you give us, the more it helps.
And the other risk to pre-funding is the fact that you have to trust that the director and the folks who are operating the library are going to use that money really brutally, right? That excess that we're asking for is actually going to be saved and receive interest or do us for
That's a risk in my mind.
But aren't we always trusting them with their budget and their reserve anyway?
We are, it's just, we're giving them an addition to that regular budget and asking them to hold things good for us. So,
Write them a $500,000 check, saying don't spend it all at once.
And that's, and that's another reason to have this like facilities management plan where you're saying, doing a check this year, we're doing the part this year, we're doing the break this year. It's like,
well, so just thinking out loud again, but I don't think there's a risk to the library at some point. So I don't think that's a substantial risk. I do think that future councils will be talking about truth in taxation, whether or not they do it or not. I'm not sure. But I think the library won't necessarily say, especially if it's a nominal amount. I think the fact that the board already voted for the $100,000 a year, and we've got to put some prudence on that. You know, trust that they thought through this, that they discussed it, they vetted that amount specifically. I don't know. I guess at this point, I would just say, let's move forward with the requests that they made and maybe use the next 6 or 12 months to come up with a facilities plan. And also, if there is a pre-fund amount that might make sense to do it all at once, maybe do that next year, because we're not there. We don't think that at this point.
I would about 6 to 12 months to do the number, right?
So
Yeah.
I mean, 6 or 12 for next time through taxation. This just gives them what they want.
Do you want to make a motion then on?
Sure. I'll move that we move forward with truth in taxation. We requested amount from the library board, which was $100,000 target increase for this year's property tax.
I'll second that.
Do we know what the county is raising taxes, like what the hit will be, average household type thing? We know the school board not doing anything.
So when I talked to the county this morning just about the certified tax rate, they mentioned the only entity so far that's indicated they're going to do taxation is the water district. And so I don't think the county, just based on it didn't sound really.
Do we know what the water district is typically like?
I don't know what that.
They raised it last year by like a pretty small percentage. I don't think it was, well, it was just so small. It was probably more than the city, but less than the school district.
Well, the school district.
A lot, I know. And this is just a complete assumption. I just don't think they're gonna jack it up. So
Do you have any idea what they did last year? I'm not giving you like.
Pull out a brand. I mean, if it's like 50 cents or something, it's not a big consideration. If it's $50, then we
I
might.
remember being nominal, but
it wasn't, yeah, it wasn't huge.
total tax is not very low.
So for me, I would prefer to fund them at a higher level while the school and nobody else is asking. Just because it seems like a good year, and even their highest amount that they're asking would be a relatively modest increase for each person's taxes. And that it's not something that has to be worried about for many years in the future. I don't know, the next time the school district is gonna have to do something big, or the city will need to. I just don't, I don't wanna create a tension on our district.
So it looks like the district proposed last year's $22 on the average home, 29.23% above last year's property.
The water district?
That's what I'm saying on their public hearing notice.
So I'm gonna ask a silly question, but do Provo residents receive the Central Utah
Yes,
water company?
Yeah.
They do, okay.
yes. Yeah, our taxes went up last
Okay,
year.
Kelsey, so last year, what they had noticed was on the average residence, it would be a $22 increase, just like Shannon said. So, thank you.
Anyways, like, let's just assume the district's not raising that this year.
I was hoping we'd come in under $10, single digits are a lot easier to stomach than double digits.
Yeah, I also want to do what's right by the library as much as possible, we can get a baseline of what other agencies and districts are doing, but that doesn't change the need of the library.
So-
Make a substitute motion, Rachel?
Well, I'm also thinking about what Dave was saying about an amount that's not the full 500, so it was like 350. All right, I just wish I knew what the number would, that magical number that you hinted existed, that we don't know yet.
Well, we could do, we had both of our number, right? So whatever we do, we need to make sure we want to do that or below.
I'll put this out for a little context as well. So this number does not include that additional almost $60,000 in revenue that's baked in based off the rate. So this 100 is in theory 160.
Yeah.
So
So
If that
300 is 360.
Well, and a relatively arbitrary way to pick a number, I like that.
You're like 300.
I like 300. What would it be if we put in 300?
$7.87.
Anyone else have opinions on this?
Can someone restate what the motion was? I'm having a little difficulty hearing everybody.
Push that in.
So George, I haven't made a substitute motion.
Please, Dave's motion. Dave's motion was to do it at 100,000 a year. But the original ask was.
And we're still considering
Okay.
on board public safety as well.
Yeah, and this is just the library portion, and.
So how much are we contemplating for the public safety?
We haven't gotten to that discussion yet.
Well, I wonder if it wouldn't help to have that discussion so we know what the total ask we are making of our citizens might be. I don't know.
That's a good point. Okay, yeah, let's put a pin in this then and go to the Provo City.
What do we do with the motion?
Well, yeah, as you've got a motion on the table. So we okay?
Rescind it?
Okay, sure. Okay.
All right, we're gonna put a pin in this, the library discussion. We rescinded.
I mean, unless you feel like making a motion that at this point we're approving a minimum of the 2.87 or what the $100,000 equivalent.
I think it's
and then
great
we
to.
could-
That's a great idea.
I was thinking the same thing you were, George. I'd like to get a full picture. That's why I was asking about.
Okay.
Can we reach out?
Okay.
Figure out who the contact. That'd be amazing. All right, we're also staff's gonna try and reach out to the Provo Water District to see if we can get any info there. Central, yes, thank you. All right, so looking at Provo City,
Now, I was just saying, given the complexities of the rates and stuff, I don't know how the likelihood will find out from the water district, but that in and of itself is one of the reasons why the system works the way that it does, which is that all you're really deciding today is a maximum. And then you could always walk it back later after you find that out.
which I do think is wise to overestimate, just to leave ourselves with a river. But, so Justin, do you want to go over the Provo City little abbreviated?
Yep, let's see.
Back to the PowerPoint.
Yeah, we go back to the PowerPoint, just the inflationary numbers.
Yeah. One second, just have to find it in the 500 tab we have.
Slide 6. So you may remember this from last week. We went over some of the inflationary numbers and the calculations that were put up on the screen. 2022 inflation, 6.5%, 5-year average, just over or just shy of 4.5%, and the 10-year rolling average of just under 3%. Also looked at what inflation for the Western United States, which was slightly higher, 7.4 for 2022, 5-year rolling average of 5.18, and 10-year of just shy of 3.5. With that in mind, we put together can you jump over to the
Yes.
spreadsheet now? All of those possibilities, as well as a few that were thrown out of 3% and 5% as rounder numbers that came out of the conversation. So happy to start with any or all of those. This is the updated sheet with the latest numbers from and latest valuation and rates from the county assessor that we received today. So 3% would bring in roughly $160,000, and you would be looking at just under $8 on an average per well. The other that was thrown out was 5% at just shy of $266,000 and $10.59 is where you would be at. We can adjust with any number, plug it in where you'd like to, but thought we'd use that as a jumping off point.
And the need to raise this, the general city taxes originates with what?
So the reason that we look at treatment taxation regularly on the property tax.
I mean, I'm not saying, I think we should look at it regularly, but I mean, last year we were saying this was for public safety, and this year we're saying it's for.
I think it's consistent. I think we would be consistent with that. I think it would be a public safety ask each year if we're going to look at this.
Every single year, we intend to follow this money.
The idea would be sales tax will go up and down on us over time. Property tax will stay relatively flat. And if our city grows at all, there's going to be this disjointed amount of some kind if we're trying to increase our police, for example. You know, in years like we've had the last 2 or 3 years, you know, with the increases that we've had in sales tax, we can say, well, sales tax is going, you know, we're just fine. But that's not always going to be the case, obviously. Even if we grow commercially as a city, I don't think sales tax is going to be a sustainable answer. Things like public safety or don't go up and down based on the economy that is stays consistent. So I think from a financial planning standpoint, funding public safety through property tax makes more sense than funding public safety through something that's variable. Because public safety is to stay on consistent, it's going to be rise. And so the idea, I think, is just match that up with something that you look at each year, like property tax, make a nominal adjustment for, and allow the city to continue staffing the police specifically to the extent that the city grows marginally each year, that we can maintain a good market of that, because we know sales taxes that's around.
So every single year, almost every single year, police department would receive a increase.
They'd have funding to basically add it. If we did it as that long term.
Well, and I think we were looking at, like, right now, police force of under like 7 FTE. So maybe it wouldn't be indefinitely, but trying to get closer to the full staffing, so to speak.
Well, and that's part of my question is like, we got this presentation, there's different ways of measuring how many FTEs the police department needs. Did we ever land on how many FTEs the police department needs?
They had an
And then-
independent auditor.
Yeah, but there-
Sorry.
they did a few years ago, but then there's also like, you could do it based on crime rates, you could do it based on population, you could do it based on other cities in Utah, you could do it, there's like, they had 5 or different variables that had different FTEs affiliated with each one. And so I just don't ever feel like we've landed on saying, this is our goal for public safety. It's just kind of like, here's something, and with a shoulder shrug. So that's kind of what I'm asking is, do we have a definitive outcome? Are we budgeting for outcomes, or are we just really just out to raise taxes because we need to in order to combat it? But it may or may not go to public safety, or we may or may not be getting the outcomes that we hope to get in public safety. See what I'm saying?
I assumed all along that these increases, the last year's and the one we're contemplating now, were the mechanism that would allow us, among the other budget pressures that the city's facing, to hire another police officer as a minimum, because otherwise we don't, that's a pretty significant amount of money. So as long as, the budget that we end up approving has that request in it, and we are using this as the mechanism to fund it, I think that's what we're doing. I mean, that's what we've always been talking about. We recognize that one of the reasons why that's hard is because of the situation in which the cost of living problem makes our budget harder to use every year for the increasing expenses that we face. So we're just repeating what we did last year.
And just as an example, Travis said that one study reported to be 7 more police officers. But
I didn't do the study.
No, I know. And I'm using this as an example. Let's say it's 7. But I also remember the police chief saying that they didn't have full FTEs right now for, what they were budgeted for. So I'm just trying to understand, is there a definitive outcome for the police department?
Well, I think there was a question mark in this year's budget as far as the 5-year plan that we asked for as a council from a staffing standpoint for the police. Absolutely, but I don't think because there's a question there, so we should try to staff and try to help create a more sustainable model for public safety in Provo. I guess that's my, yes, ideally we have a better model over the next 5 years for fully staffing what the police need is, but independent of that, I'm still willing to support something that's more sustainable to marginal increases on the force. Just have to do with the growth of our city and trying to maintain some focus on that, even when budgets are low.
And that 5-year plan is being worked on, but where should we see that? The, on the budget, was it 2 or 3 please that were not fulfilled? 2. One was, well, we did 2. They asked for 4. That's for 4, okay. So 4 were asked for as necessary. And the budget currently fulfilled 2 of them.
Was the airport funded police officer stuff?
So that's fire.
No, the fire was the airport. And she just, in fact, I just texted her, so I had you run down and answer this question. Come in and take all the questions. Would that be helpful? Right.
Yeah, I think we know, we know, I mean, we know we need more than one, we need multiple officers. So I don't know why we need to rehash the question. We've been behind in officers for as long as I've been on the council, by you know, by several numbers, not by just one. So I don't think we need to keep rehashing the question. The question is live and real and persistent for the city, that we need to fund more public safety personnel than we have the budget for.
Like we
And that's why
regularly,
we need to.
we regularly get
Yeah.
emails about the lack of enforcement on speeding, right? And it comes down to a lack of officers. That's the answer.
Now, to argue the other side, which I actually believe that I would rather not just tie it to officers. I think that it needs to be more of an inflationary thing, just because the cost of operations, doing everything in the city is going up. And by not doing a true taxation and keeping up with that, we're losing purchasing power throughout the city every single year. And I think it would probably be better just to have it as a general policy. We need to do true taxation each year just to keep up, to keep our purchasing power, so that we can have employees throughout the city, so we can buy the supplies that we need as a city, instead of only tying it to public safety.
And the counter to that would be that when services need to expand, and when you need to do one-off, for example, IT, you know, all kinds of IT pieces, right? And we can, in a year where sales tax increases dramatically, we can look at some of those projects and start to accomplish some of those. In a year where sales tax doesn't expand, yeah, we're kind of out of.
Yeah,
I
but
love
I'm not
that.
thinking about budget things. I think about all of our regular ongoing expenses. Our paper clips are, you know, everything goes up with inflation.
Okay.
And the tax funds that we get do not go up with that unless we do this move,
Property taxes.
right?
There's a good argument to be had with sales tax and fees due, right? So there is an offset that's happening when we have a significant inflationary year like last year. We see it in our sales taxes, you know, so there's a revenue offset that's happening. It's just not all of it.
Yeah.
And so there's a shortfall.
Well, and that's why the amount that we go up with truth in taxation doesn't have to match the inflation exactly, because precisely what you said with the sales tax, those are going up as well. But I think it should go up every year to account for these extra costs. And if that's just the standard expectation, then we don't have to tie it to 1.5 police officers or whatever. And given that there's a certain amount of fungibility with the money, you know, if we're getting the money that we use as general inflation, it also means that we've got the room in the budget to get an officer of public safety, right? So part of it is labeling.
Yeah, I'm not as worried about it, because if the mayor expects the council to do this truth in taxation, that she's going to get that additional money, then she does have some discretion with other departments as well. We would use with each department in ways that they might be able to expand and not use budget that she's eligible for that additional money, right? So in the total, the effect that you're talking about, I think, can take place regardless of whether or not we say we want this particular part of this.
Yeah, but it does matter for what story we're presenting to our constituents, right? If we're saying we have to do this to get an officer, or we need to do this just because costs are going up for us, just like they're going up for you. And I don't know, I mean, the end result needs to be the same, that we do need the additional funds because we do operate on a balanced budget. But I don't know which is more palatable or which has more support, even though the end result is the same.
I think we're gonna only confuse the public if we don't make this specifically about public safety. Because it's if it just sounds like generic money that's floating out there, because we need it. We know we need public safety. This is a good way to target the request to the citizens and help them to appreciate the fact that the services that the city provides them that are vital cost us money, and they are increasingly difficult to pay for, let alone expand and increase with a growing population unless we adjust our taxes in this way. So I still think we ought to stick to that messaging and make it clear that that's what this is about. Otherwise, I think we're inviting more trouble than we want.
Do we have the one for the percentages for the city?
Yes, this is it, and we can go,
I think there was a PowerPoint that showed it just real simple, right? PowerPoint.
Yeah, where's the,
slightly different again, because
Oh,
those are
right.
old numbers, but
we just increase this, make that bigger than the part of ours?
Zoom, my friend.
Did we get any word back from Utah,
Water.
Central Utah
Central
Water.
Utah Water?
I'm asked yet.
so this is your debt service rate that'll change every year based off of our debt service. This is the general operations rate that was certified by the county. Here's your library rate and then your total city rate. So again, average residential property valuation in the city. Property tax is calculated off of 55% of that value if it's owner occupied. And so this is just your rate times valuation. Gives you your 3 line items and your total property tax bill for that individual household. Looking,
And that's just the city portion.
yep, just the city portion. So this green cell, that is what the addition would be. In this case, if you were to raise 5%, so that would be your additional revenue. This is the budgeted revenue citywide that would come from the rate that's certified by the county. And so this would be your total with the rate increase. So your 5.3 million plus the $266,000 roughly that you would take from your increase. This is the certified valuation from the county. And then this is your,
So is it 5% or 7.8? Is it 7.8 because of both?
well, so this is, your revenue would increase by 5%. It would bring the tax bill up 7.8%. So this is all based off of a average valuation each year. And so it's based off of what that average value would have been the year before. So even last year, even though there was an increase, valuation went up so high that you actually would have, your rate went down, even though the council chose to go through truth and taxation. So you can see the fluctuation over 10 years of what property taxes have looked like.
So 5% is a $10 difference for the average household?
Yes, yeah, $10.59.
That's just the policy part?
Yep, that's just the general operations portion.
Right. And so that's not how much they'll get charged. That's the amount difference that they would get charged based on us doing truth and taxation.
Right.
They'll be paying, right, probably $300 or $400. And then right that, the one the last one.
That's a 5% for $265,000. I guess the question that I think we need to answer as a council is, do we want to increase do we want to have truth in taxation being increased based on where inflation really changed? Or do we want it to be some amount that targets what we're trying to accomplish? If we're trying to accomplish public safety of an officer, which if it's for one officer and their equipment, then we're talking about a 3% change, not a 5% change. If it's more based on where inflation actually was, then it could be that higher number. I mentioned last time that my preference for the council, my expectation last year was that if we were going to look at this each year, we were going to look at it some nominal amount that was consistent, so that the public didn't have to trust us on where inflation went year to year, or have the discussion about why is it different this year than it was last year as far as the rate change. I think if we're going to do it consistently, I think it'd be a lot easier to say, look, here's the 20-year average of inflation, which has been about 3%. And that's what we're going to have truth in taxation about each year. And we'll vote on each year. It's not a given that it's going to happen. But I think it's worth considering each year to try to keep up with that from a basic services standpoint. So,
Doesn't our 2022 numbers that show that it's going to sort of lower the rate overall?
well, that's a valuation issue, right? So even though we increase, so people still pay net more, right? But we shouldn't even show that. Well, sorry. Because candidly, the average citizen doesn't understand why their rate goes up or down. When I talk to the average person, they say, well, I paid more, so how did my rate go down? Well, because your valuation went up, and everybody's asset component of your property tax went up.
Right.
So even though your rate went down, your value went up, and now you're still paying much. Yeah, and all we care about is how much more we
They don't even
pay.
know who does what, they just blame everyone for everything. right?
So last year, if I'm not mistaken, it was about $5 or $6. Something like that was the actual net change, the averages, and that's how much it would be this year too. 3%. Yeah, 2.2.
And so 3% on the average home, $7.80.
Yeah, no, their increase was double, less than inflation.
The 3% is 280. I mean, 780.
Yeah, 780. Annually.
So that's actually very close to the 300K for the library, because that was 787.
Yeah. I had an additional thought on that. I don't want to joke about it.
So, go ahead.
But the break even, just quick math, the break even is about 300 for 5 years. The problem is, and I think this is to Carla's point, once you get past the 5 years, then they'd be short of what they were trying to do long term, if that makes sense. So even though over a 5-year period of time, it breaks, it's about what she was asking for to do 100 each year. The long-term piece after we get past that 5 years is underfunding what they had hoped for by increasing each year.
Yeah. So you guys can do more.
To do more or to stay with what they had asked for, which is that change. So eventually we're at 500,000 more in ongoing revenue indefinitely. Or if we do the 300, they'll have what they asked for within the 5 years, but after we've done the 5 years, they're short of what they had hoped for.
Right.
He's saying do less, but be more consistent, actually, right?
The issue with that, and I support consistency, is we have got control over it.
I do think it's an easier thing to go to the public, but that we're trying to do, that there is some consistent format to where we're going to do.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. I mean, 2 years from now, council could say, we don't want to make it. We don't need to re-elect it.
Yeah, easy to be consistent here too, but for consistency.
Right.
It's
It's easier for me to say, I think we should do this, not running for election every year. So, just candidly, like I'm not worried about anything politically, so I didn't look at this and say, I think this is the right thing to do, and it doesn't matter.
So you're back to 100 for water rate.
Yeah, I think that's definitely my.
He's still there.
Still there. Okay.
Yeah, I guess I don't fear that council would defund the library. This conversation that we're having now about the city, expanding support for public safety and having to do truth taxation for that, and trying to offset inflation, which the average person in the cities is I don't even know what we're talking. Like, I don't get why you would need to raise additional property tax money. It seems like I'm paying more every year anyway. I mean, that's a much harder conversation I think that the general truth of taxation has nothing to do with the library, then the library won't. I think the library won't be an easier conversation. So, again, not
If the total, so going back to Brian's point though, we just need the maximum that we're going to ask, and then we can always lower it, right? So for the purposes of this meeting, we could consider this $7.8 tax increase to be the maximum we're contemplating for the city portion. And we could consider I forgot what the total was for $300,000 for the library portion as the maximum we would consider for that. There seems like that was close to comparable, and then we could deliberate those exact totals going forward. Just one proposal. I'm willing to make that a motion. I just thought I would ask if that's kind of what we're looking for. We just need to find the maximum totals we're asking for the two.
Yeah, so what were you saying, George? What would be your motion? Or you?
I guess my motion would be to use this total that's on the screen for the library portion as the maximum that we're going to contemplate, and the total that was on the screen just a second ago for the city portion as the maximum that we're going to consider for the city. So they're almost exactly the same.
it's safe, George. I just don't see any rationale behind the 250 or 300. If it doesn't give them the funding and we have to come back anyway within a few years, it doesn't really accomplish what I was hoping to accomplish, which is to pre-fund it and not have to come back, within the next 5 to 7 years. If we do 300, they're going to be back within 4 or 5 years saying we need additional funding.
Or next year, we could just do 200, but that would be done, have it done in 2 years.
Or you could do
So your proposal, David, would be to do the 100,000 this year, and then the $7.80 from the city portion as the combined total. So that would be around $10.
just over 10.
What percentage is it? 5%?
That was 3%. It's 160,000.
I just remember being really frustrated last year to find out that we had done too low of a number.
Sorry.
Oh, it was just frustrating last year to learn that we had asked for too low of a number because the other numbers came in and just wasn't sufficient. I would rather ask for more or notice more.
Well, we wouldn't know the difference between noticing it and what we actually, we won't, I mean, being frustrated with what we did last year is an issue of what inflation was after we get through the year, right? And there's nothing, we don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't know. I think that's, again, I just defaulting to like, can we be consistent? Can we be simple? And yeah, but I just put higher preference on that, I guess. Because if we try to forecast what next year's inflation might be, I mean, the 12-month, right, we just got the number was 4%, but it could be 6, it could be 2. We don't know what the next 12 months will be. What we do know is that 30 years later, 50 years later, the long-term inflation rate has been about 3%. So I think it's easier to say, well, over decades, even though we've had much higher years and we've had much lower years, that's been the long-term inflation rate. It's easier for me to explain.
I think water district might be 4%.
That they're asking for.
That's my information.
4%, do we know how that compares?
They said it's the same as last year. What they did.
Last year wasn't. Last year.
We'll give it to Mr. Taylor.
Yep, let's put it to Mr. Taylor.
Yes,
Or do we have Mr. Taylor here from police? Captain Taylor. So any questions we'd like to put towards Captain Taylor?
So we've been talking about, the idea of each year having some form of additional funding to support police, to support public safety. And the question was brought up, how do we know, that we aren't just adding officers each year, or how do we unnecessarily, right? If we were to do this, and our understanding has been based on past presentations that even if we were to add an officer each year for the next 4 or 5 years, we're not going to get to a point where we're going to be saying, oh, we've got too many officers now to accomplish good public safety in Provo. And then we're still going to be short of the ideal, even if we were to add one a year for the next few years.
That is accurate. I don't think we're in danger of overstaffing the police department anytime soon. And I will tell you, of course, I have an interest in appropriate staffing in the police department, right? But we're not near that standard. And Chief Beebe has articulated several different metrics for understanding what appropriate staffing looks like in this police department.
Any one of those we're below, right?
Any one of those we're below. So there's a workflow analysis, and there's a population analysis, and there's a regional average analysis, and all of those analyses would show that the department is getting by with understanding. And it hurts our ability to do reasonable public safety tasks in the airport and in the patrol division. And there are needs for other officers and other areas right now, but airport and the patrol division are the ones that stand out. And so, Scout's honor, you're not going to overstaff the police department at the rate of 1 a year. Those aren't the numbers.
If we give you the funding for another officer, will you be able to find one and hire them?
The answer to that is always yes. It's a challenge, but it's the game of running across you ever play that game when they give you a Dixie cup? You've got to run across the field and fill the cup at the other side. That's what it's like to staff a department. So wherever you set the maximum, there's always spillage coming out of the cup as we travel. And so if you look at the department in any given year and say, well, we funded you to the level of 122 or whatever the number is, and I see now that you're at 118, that's not an indication that we haven't utilized what you've given us. That's just the nature of running a human operation. But if you set the level at 125, then we will run at 122. You set it at 130, we'll run at 125. That's how it operates. And so, yes, we will utilize every FTE that you authorize to us, but there's always attrition, spillage, turnover, resignation. Those things happen. And we have to plan to replace those people continuously.
Would it make more sense to put more money and efforts into retaining officers we've already got and trained than it would be to adding on additional officers?
Those things that's the left glove and the right glove. We do those things and we do our best to take care of people and to create a culture where they want to work, where they feel valued, where they have some sense of ownership in their work. And those are the major drivers of culture that contribute to retention. That plus wellness. And we do all of those things. And I'm sure there's people in our wellness group who would be wanting me to say more about it. The council will fund my priority about wellness.
But we are invested in keeping our people. But we have to plan for appropriate staffing levels to accomplish that mission.
So would it be best to, as we're looking at these numbers, have enough that you could allocate that to another officer, but maybe another little bit that could go for your wellness or retention programs? Like, would that be appropriate? Like, I'm trying to figure out what target we should be going for here.
I have an obligation to stand here and tell you it's personnel. It's people. We need people. We need the staffing to accomplish our missions. We need the staffing. We can't back away from our involvement in the schools. We cannot back away from our commitment to community policing in the community-based policing office, which solves problems in all the neighborhoods of the city. We can't back away from our day-to-day patrol response and the timeliness of response that comes from having the correct amount of officers in the patrol. There are so many things that we must do that we can't even really branch out into things that we should be doing. I could tell you what some of those are, but I'm telling you right now, just to accomplish our mission in patrol and at the airport, we need more bodies. And I feel like we're making a reasonable and responsible effort to do the retention efforts that you mentioned, including wellness things. So I have to prioritize it first.
Okay. Thank you, Captain Taylor. Any questions for Captain Taylor? Just me. George?
No, I'm good, thanks.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. I'm always at your school.
Good. Thank you.
Makes it feel like, why are we only doing one officer?
Well, I think the ask was 2, right?
But the 3% is for the one budget. 3% only allows us to pay for one more officer. Right? And it's what, about 130?
I would lean towards, because those were down to 5%. Just as sort of notice at the high. And then the whatever equates to 100,000 for the library.
So 5% is $10.59 for the average home. Plus $262. I mean, like you're trying to make a combo without cross streaming.
No, I mean, I understand what you're saying. I also don't want to notice way above what we expect to land on. So I'd much rather come to some kind of, if it's higher, great, but we're not gonna, slide that number after we notice it. I'd rather have that number be what we expect to do. Again, anything we can do, I think, from a public from a public perspective, to not confuse or add to what is already a stressful topic, for most people. So if we need to go for 5 or 6%, I think we should discuss that and not anticipate sliding it down. For me, again, it's not if we were just going to vary with what we need, then we would be asking for, 3 or 4 or 5 officers. If we were going to go off inflation, we'd be going off of, 7 or 8% based on what's been going on the last year or two, or how we've had to increase, incomes and, it would be a much higher number just to keep up with how, we've had to just for pay, FTE. For me, I'm not trying to satisfy either one of those. I'm just trying to make a donation, to the bucket, something that I think is meaningful, but not trying to satisfy the whole thing, and trying to balance the fact that after what the average citizen in Provo digested last year from a property tax standpoint, I want to try to keep this as minimal as we possibly can.
As far as the 5%, I think it's considerably less than inflation. And I like that it builds the necessary on the budget of at least 2 officers. That was kind of my thought.
So was there a motion on this David, that you were making, or?
George's motion from before never got a second. as
Oh,
far
I
as
didn't know that they motion.
He did actually make the motion, but,
What was it?
so he said,
Go ahead,
Go ahead.
Elizabeth. Well, I was just gonna say, yeah, I did make a motion. It was to, consider a maximum of, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the percentages are, but for the library portion, it was the $300,000 equivalent. And for our portion, it would be this, that's in green on the screen. But if others feel differently about the library portion and we drop that down to the 100%, then that's fine. That's acceptable to me. And then the motion, I think, should be that we consider the maximum of the equivalent of 100,000 for the library, and then stay with this number that's on the screen for the city portion. So I would like to know whether my fellow counselors agree with reducing the library down to the lowest amount that's been proposed, to the 100,000, to combine with this amount that's on the screen.
The only proposed amount technically was, I mean, we showed different numbers, but the board only asked for the 100,000. So that's the proposal. I think we're just agreeing with the proposal.
yeah.
From the one on the screen is a 5% increase, if I'm not mistaken. Justin, is this the 5%?
Yeah, this is 5%.
And
For the
again,
general operation portion.
like I mentioned before, I'm not in favor of doing anything more consistent with what we asked for last year. But, you know, we can notice at the higher level and still debate this and discuss this. I would just, I thought it's still that part too.
I would prefer we notice at the lower levels. I prefer, we know the amount for approximately amount for one officer, we know the amount that the library asked for. I prefer we notice at those amounts.
So the lower amount that you're looking at for the city portion, are you thinking
I think
3%?
it was 3% on the city side and it was $100,000 on the library side. This,
So what is the total amount of money again for 3%?
160,000.
it was 159 and change, George. And that's about what a new officer all in for benefits and training and such costs, right?
You're about 130 for an officer, equipment, and first payment on a vehicle.
But if we want it to be electric, we need to.
Over the ends.
I just think what's absent from this conversation is that, you know, the homeowners are feeling the impact of inflation all around. I mean, they've been, like Dave was saying, you know, but I'm just gonna say my property taxes are over $5,000 on our home, so it's a lot of money. I mean, just all in, it's a big payment, and I know I'm not average because our house is larger and we have a large lot, but I know the typical person is paying thousands of dollars in property taxes. So, and it was a big hit, and then you just think like people lost like last year almost 7% of their discretionary income due to inflation. I mean, that's a big deal for lower incomes for sure. So I'd say just, you know, we know what people ask for, we know what an officer, or what the library asks for, we know what an officer costs. Prefer we just be cliche, but try to be fiscally conservative. And I know sometimes fiscally conservative means spending money. But in any of these cases, we can't spend enough to get caught up right now anyway, so at least we can do something that puts us in a better spot. 5 2 cents.
It is a big deal. But like you said, the city is really the same percentages that homeowners are with. And homeowners still complain about the roads and the sidewalks. And the park's not being done at time, or, you know what I mean, it's a tricky one.
Well, I'll just stick with my motion just for the sake of moving this forward. I still think we ought to consider something as high as what's on the board, on the screen right now for the city. We can decide. What's that?
You changed it on the screen. I will second your motion if you go to the 100,000 for the library.
So that's
100,000.
that you would.
Yeah, no,
No, he already amended it.
He did perfect. No, he didn't. He just restated what he had said before. So he said 300,000 for the library.
Okay, I would amend the motion at 100,000 for the library.
No.
So
Hold on. Can I just say my motion? My motion is to lower it to the 100,000 for the library, and to propose the 5% for the city as the maximum. We can always lower it later, but I'm loath to make that decision right now. So that's my motion. If others want to support that, they can.
I'm the second.
You are the second, okay.
So, question on the procedure for that. So the original motion no longer exists because it was amended to this.
What was the original motion?
300,000 and then the 5%.
That motion was by George?
Yes.
George, that was never
That was
seconded.
never seconded.
Okay,
So
so
that,
this is the motion, it wasn't.
so the current motion is 5% and 1%.
That was seconded by.
So then, based on our discussion, I would just move to amend the motion to the 103%.
And I second that.
I got it right. And so now we vote on the amendment motion, and then
There's no discussion. There's no word.
Discussion on the amendment motion.
let's have a discussion on the amended motion.
Just replay everything Dave said.
Well, that's, yeah, and I guess I would say, you know, it's proper procedure to ask, but that doesn't mean that everybody has to repeat.
Yeah, we've had enough discussion, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, or we can find. Four box.
Where are we supposed to be? We just have 1 hour left.
Are we still need the time? I don't.
The times are very flexible.
Yeah,
I
okay.
So the,
So here's my only thought on comparing the two motions, is if we adopt the one with the higher percentage, then we can get feedback from people in the city and see what they think about that higher number, and we can stick with it, or we can drop it down. And we can have those discussions in the context of, if you feel that this is outrageous, then we're probably going to go down to the 3%. Is that?
We only have a week to do that. Approximately. No, you just have to notice the highest amount,
Yeah,
and then you have until August to decide the final amount.
And we have 2 truth and taxation hearings before you decide that.
so that way we could talk to our people and we could know what they think. If they think that additional 2% is egregious, or if it's a good investment. Maybe they'll hate us all anyway. I don't know.
I guess it just leaves a window open, so we haven't really decided. You know, it's like, well, it might be, it could be 4.5, it could be 3.2, it could be 2.9. So I would like it if we were to narrow the scope and say, this is what we're actually considering. Give us your feedback on what we're actually considering.
Right. Yeah, and it's exactly. So for me, I would be soliciting feedback on what do you think about the 5% or the 3%. But I would put the 3% as the floor.
Yeah.
And I would say, I already know what the post is going to say. I think the post would say go lower. But I've already made my choice. So.
Any more discussion on this?
All question.
Is it called vote?
What type of vote does it need to be?
Gonna vote on the amended motion.
Well, no, I mean, technically roll call votes, you can read required for resolutions and ordinance, but if you wanted to do raise of hands and saying carries 4-3 with so and so opposed or something.
I'm just curious.
I can't see Jordan's hand through the album.
Yeah, roll call makes sense.
So we're gonna all vote on the motion. Okay, so we're calling a vote on the amended motion, which would be to fund the library at 100,000 and to fund the city at 3%. Councilor Hogan.
No.
You seconded the motion.
No, I didn't. Oh, wait, the library at, oh, yes, I'm on it. Yes, I'm on it. Sorry. I was thinking we were calling a vote on George's, my bad.
Councilor
Yes.
Hanley.
No.
Councilor Ellsworth.
Yes.
Councilor Fillmore. Excused. Councilor McKay, no. Councilor Shipley.
Yes.
Councilor Whipple.
No.
Yes, the motion fails, so the original motion is now still on the table.
Okay, so now we are going to vote on the original motion, which was to fund the library at 100,000 and to do truth and taxation for the city at 5%, which can be, both those numbers can go down.
So I have a clarification on this.
Okay.
So if we're gonna get split votes and can't come out of here with some kind of vote for truth and taxation, we just can't get a vote on truth and taxation.
Yeah,
Today, because it's not necessary to decide today. That it was more kind of, as I stated earlier, it would help staff if we knew whether to bring one
What to bring next?
version of the ordinance to next week's council meeting or two versions. So, yeah, and it, which again goes, if this, so let's say we vote on this, on the motion that's currently at the table and it fails. I would probably suggest, based on what I'm hearing from everybody, somebody make a motion to bring the truth and taxation version of the ordinance to next week's meeting and not say anything about numbers and just see if that passes. And then decide on the numbers next Tuesday.
The comment I'll make here is we don't have Bill today. I won't be there next week. We're gonna have 6 councilors. I mean, I don't know how Bill votes. And I don't know if I change my mind to the future. Yeah, just put that out there.
Because we may, at some point, and we've done this, this has happened in the past with some budget issues. We may end up at a point where every individual decision has to be made by its own motion, because lumping everything into one, that's what causes that. Separation.
The library.
okay, well, we'll vote on this motion and then go from there. So this is the motion that George made, 100,000 in library, 5% for the city. Councilor Hanley.
Yes.
Councilor Ellsworth.
No.
Councilor Fillmore's excused, myself McKay, yes. Councilor Shipley.
No.
Councilor Whipple.
Yes.
Councilor Hogan.
No.
Okay,
Can you restate all of that, because that went really fast.
Split vote.
It was the
three. Yeah. Well, how about make a motion that we fund the library for 1,000? Would somebody like to second that?
I'll second.
All right, seconded by Dave Shipley. Let's do a vote on that. Councilor.
Sorry,
Ellsworth.
can you say it again? I didn't hear it very clearly.
Just breaking it up, making a motion that we fund the library at 100,000.
Okay, thanks.
Shipley seconded it.
Which would mandatorily make us do truth and taxation.
Right, so that answers the question.
Yeah. So Councilor Ellsworth.
Yes.
Councilor Fillmore's excused. Myself, McKay, yes. Councilor Shipley.
Yes.
Councilor Whipple. Yes. Councilor Hogan.
Yes.
Councilor Hanley.
Yes.
All right, so that passes 6-6 with Fillmore excused. 6-0 with Fillmore excused. All right, is there anything else you want to discuss?
I just think it'd be helpful for next meeting if we could get some sort of idea of the intent of the central retail level.
That would be great. We can ask staff to look into that. Supposedly they meet next Wednesday, I believe. So maybe we could get that answered before that.
Even if it's not an exact number.
Yeah. Okay, so staff look into, what the water service district is going to do. And in the next meeting, we could have the numbers for the 3%, the 5% again. And,
Shannon, are you missing all meetings next year? Like
Yeah,
work and council?
correct.
Can you call that in?
Do you want to call me for that discussion? Like we pulled out.
Yeah, if it's a difference of us getting anything out of there.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. Will you do that, Dave? We can give you a 2-minute warning and jump out, yeah.
and,
Is there anything else staff can prepare?
yes, I was gonna say that to prepare the exact number for 1 officer and 2 officers.
Or the exact number is 3 and 5%.
Both. But also the price, the cost of 1 officer and 2 officers. Anything else anyone would like to see in that next meeting? All right, so on to the next one. I guess the special rate of property tax will be just did, correct?
Yes.
Okay, I did remember what I was referring to you guys as far as what was appropriated, and it was the money we appropriated last year in our truth and taxation. We did not appropriately appropriate that money, so it's sitting. And we have to appropriate the money that we put into truth and taxation before it can be used. That's something I didn't know until a couple weeks ago.
Well, and the easiest way to do that, because you can be approving a budget at the same time, is for that money to be a line item in the budget that you approve at the same time.
So we need to do a motion on that then to have it put in as a line item in public safety.
Well, not, I mean, you can, it's a general system.
One thing, it's a little bit complicated, and that is that, there's one-time money available in the current budget, okay? But the property tax that was approved was part of the base property tax that's already in the 24 budget. And so there's not money in the 24 budget. There's one-time money available in the 23, and that could be appropriated. That makes sense?
That's somebody I was talking about, right? That was it 100 and something?
The amount, like 190, I think nothing to do with that. But that could be, if there was any specific public safety needs or whatever the council wanted to, it would need to be one kind of money.
Yes, but does it have to be specifically stated that was paid for, or just put it towards the budget of these?
It could be an appropriation increase in expenditure for police, yeah. The other thing that could be done is it could be carried over and then appropriated in 24 as well. But it just needs to realize that that the ongoing has already been included.
But the ongoing, we don't know yet what rate we're going to approve. But that ongoing is not in the budget yet, right?
That's right. But the rate adjustment last year that came to the taxation area is included in the 24.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It was 147,000. That's what I remember. That's so much. Okay. And like if we're to increase future and taxation and increase the general operations revenue for 24, like in that period, I bet we could tie it to something more specific. Because I think last year it was just some general public safety costs. And so with that, it's like, well, does it go on fire? Does it go on police? So we stuck it in general services that's working until it's appropriated. But maybe to avoid that in the future.
Yeah, we want to avoid that as much of the office here.
It could also be carried over and spent
Later.
later.
Okay, any discussion about that to figure out how we want to?
Well, I just, I'd have to go back to our discussions, but my understanding was that was for an officer,
Right.
so.
Right.
Whatever we need to do now.
Yeah, so how can we get that written up such that at our next meeting, we can appropriate that appropriately for this officer? Do we take a motion on that?
Do you wanna, I mean, John, what's your recommendation if they do an appropriation this fiscal year to go ahead and put it into the budget to then carry it over? Or do you just wanna add it to a line item for the 24?
It's a line item right now in general services.
Right.
I wanna move it to police personnel, I guess.
But the problem with moving it to personnel is that, it's an ongoing expense.
It's not accounted for after.
We've already accounted for the 25.
We already have it.
So the question is, do we have a one-time expenditure that we need to do in public safety for 147?
Well, but hold on, couldn't we appropriate that? Couldn't we appropriate those funds once we find out what we're doing in truth and taxation? And if we're going to fund an additional officer, we could use that retroactively for that additional officer, knowing that the ongoing truth and taxation increase is going to fund that officer. So I understand why you can't put in personnel without knowing or having additional funding for that officer on an ongoing basis. But if we're going to change this year's, wouldn't that account for that?
Well, I think that runs into the same problem, but because I think the confusion a few minutes ago when that's when Kate brought this up, is that there's, in my mind, I think there's two issues here. One is the money that was approved in 23 and where it goes in the budget. And the fact that in order to prevent this from happening again, I think that when you decide on a tax rate for 24, you need to at the same time put that money into the budget already for how it's going to be spent in 24 as it comes in. And so doesn't that create this, if you lump them both into the same thing, doesn't that create the same problem that we were just trying to avoid? Does that make any sense? I think it, as I understood Councilor Shipley's proposal, it seems like
If we're going to correct for it this time, then we still have a problem.
Yeah.
I guess my thought is how are we, like, knowing that it wasn't appropriated, how did we know that went to it? I mean, I know it's flexible, obviously, we didn't, we don't have a property tax line item that has to go to personnel based on our change, but that was the expectation. So, I mean, is it just one of the two officers that we have increased for this year, really, that came from increased budget that we, I mean, I know it's not, I mean, we're moving things from different places, but I guess I'm trying to think through, like, are we really accomplishing the additional officer that we had anticipated if that was something that was budgeted change for this year? I don't care if we want to appropriate those funds, into general police and allow them to use it. I just want to make sure that we got that officer. That's, I guess, my only.
Well, we can answer that. Well, as I say, I don't know if we can catch Taylor back or not, or if the mayor Wayne knows that. I think my understanding is that part of the problem is that I think you got the allocation for the additional officer, but that because of how turnover stuff works, they never or usually don't end up spending all of the money because they are always not at full staff at any given point of the year, because anytime they hire more people, some people leave and they're off. They're never. So I think that's why they didn't actually, even though they probably got the allocation for the officer, they didn't run into a budget problem without having that money appropriated, because they never end up spending it all. They usually end up spending it all because there's always times when they don't have full staff.
Well, we don't have to approve the appropriation for it to be carried over. So, but what would we be appropriating? I mean, can't we just allow the department to carry it over like they did anything else?
Yeah.
We can. Well, my understanding too, and I was out on my accident at the time that this all this took place. But my understanding, talking with financial folks over there, that when the truth and taxation occurred, it was designated to be public safety, but it was never really designated specifically to be an additional officer. And so because that didn't happen, then the officer count did not go up, and she's sitting now in a public safety count in general services.
Well, I know that I trust the police to use them the best way they can. And it seems like we can just put it into police so they can use it as they need to.
And I guess, John, if you're saying it's already
That's already done?
It's already in the 24 budget as an ongoing expense, then they at least have the manpower allocation in from FY 24 going forward, right?
So we don't have it tied up currently if it goes to 24 budget.
It's just sitting there in general services. That the public safety can be used however the chief and want to use it.
Okay, then we're good.
We're good.
So in the future, guys, when we do our taxation, we need to be very specific about how we want to allocate it so that they can use it as soon as possible.
Well, and if it's an officer, we'll add it to the officer account. And then they'll have the ability to fill that position. And then we do the 25 budget the following year. That account will be in there and it will be included in what we start.
Okay, thank you. All right, any questions on that?
Totally confused, but I guess it begs the question, like, do we really need the officer? Did we really need to fund this then, you know? It's like,
Yeah,
did we get used?
They've been underfunded still.
Yeah, it's interesting, by allocating the money for it generally, for taxation, we gave them the capacity to get the officer. And so they do what they can to get those officers, but if we haven't given them that money for their budget, they can't even be trying to get more officers.
I think going back to Dave's point, going through the process and having it now come in through projections in property tax, you can say that one of those officers in the budget is now funded through what the council supported it for, and you just have this one-shot money.
And I would just say, the thing we need to remember in August, regardless of whether you say 3% or 5% or some other number on Tuesday, what we need to remember in August, at the time that you actually vote on what that final number is, there also needs to be a motion to say, and take the revenue from that number and put it in this line item budget.
Okay, so staff's instructed to do that, then they're gonna do that this time, or?
I think we all are aware of
We have a learning.
All
right. Okay, so sorry for that detour, but I'll work that out for this time. All right, so we've already done the discussion regarding property tax. All right, so a discussion regarding the 2024 budget adoption process, and this will be presented by Stella.
Okay, and Michael, are you in control? So, okay, great. So we thought, just in anticipation of adopting the budget, whether it was next week or in August, it'd be good to run through a few changes to the budget ordinance so you're aware of them. You can think about them. If you have any questions, you can reassess. I just want to give you an overview there. The budget ordinance, as you know, is pretty lengthy. There's a lot going on. We're not going through the whole thing, but just a few changes that as staff, and we worked with council staff and legal as well, just to kind of assess if there was any refinement or some things we've noticed in the city that could help us operate a little bit better. So these are the categories that are addressed in the budget ordinance a little bit differently than they have been in the past, or some additions. So we'll go over some carryover language, a provision regarding sick buyout budget, and then also recreation capital facilities fund, which you've heard about before. There have been a few updates to that. And then also an addition regarding multi-year purchase agreements. So we'll go through it. I don't know if you guys need a break or anything after property tax, but I can go through this fast and let you know if you have any questions.
Hey, does anybody want to? I actually do need a break.
I feel like I need one.
Thank you. Let's take a 10-minute break.
Okay, sounds good.
Recording stopped.
Yeah. All right.
Recording in progress.
We're gonna, here, so back to you, Kelsey. Our discussion regarding the 2024 budget adoption process.
Okay. So yes, budget ordinance, probably one of the least fun things to hear from anyone about, but yeah, I'll try to make it simple. We can skim over some of the stuff, but if we can dig into some of it, if you want to get deeper, like this one can be a beast or it can be something however we want to go about it. Okay, so we'll go through the carryover language, sick buyout, additional language, Rex facility fund, and then the multi-year purchase agreement is something new that we've added and just want input on. So, Michael, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So I want to take you back to last fall. I don't know if this looks familiar. I almost cried when I saw it because I was like, oh, that's about to happen again. But carryover process is starting soon. And in the past, we've kind of color coded carryover requests so it makes it simple, kind of easy to see. We have like historically universally agreed upon as a category, and we thought maybe we should make sure that it's like actually agreed upon. And so we put some of the automatic carryovers that we typically do in the budget ordinance, so that way everyone knows like this is something that we're planning on carrying over. And I'll show you kind of the language. A lot of language is already there, but we tried to structure it in a way that was more intuitive so you could see and categorize it. So let's go to the next slide and just look. We're not going to read through all of this, but basically like we have some categories in the budget ordinance that like show equipment maintenance and replacement. So this would give staff or the mayor the authorization to automatically carry over maintenance funds for general fund facilities or the vehicle replacement accounts or computer bank accounts. So again, these are things that typically we've carried over. We're just trying to make sure that it's all spelled out here. The next category is ongoing projects. This could be the grants or wildland revenue, just making sure that that money is acknowledged and that it can be carried over. And then we have other expenses that are kind of the awkward, like for example, the elections, how it happens every other year. You can't really, you don't want to budget like a spike one year and not the next year. So we just budget the same amount basically every year and then just carry over. So the account has enough to fund elections every other year. So like tuition reimbursements and indigent defense are the other categories we put in that. So we just kind of tried to clean up the carryover section of the ordinance, and hopefully now when we get to the carryover time of year, it's easier for us in finance to know exactly what is universally agreed upon and we're all on the same page. So any questions about that? Okay, great.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
We used to have a carryovers committee, right? And does it satisfy kind of the intent of that carryovers committee?
Yeah, the color coding, I think, is actually a result of the ARPA, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
Basically just saying, please, like, help us be able to see it more easily and identify what is what on carryovers. And this allows us, when we review carryovers, to just say, look, there's really only a handful of these that were a decision that we should even look at more, where before we were trying to look at the entire spreadsheet and say line by line, and let's look at every single one. We state articles interested in every single one of them. And I think this just helps us to say, look, there's only a few categories that we should even consider reviewing, as long as we agree with what we're talking about here. And it makes it very simple process. I don't know that an additional committee would be helpful. And then when they bring this, they bring it to the whole council and we can all review it together.
Okay.
When it happens. So,
And we could keep the color coding. We've even brainstormed maybe just having a list of just kind of one-time carryovers that are kind of off the beaten path and showing that to you, but also having this as a reference, but on a different page, so it's not as overwhelming. Anyway, so we will play around with that for this next carryover process. But anyway, the budget ordinance would kind of allow us to be more on the same page with the administration and council. So, okay, anything else on carryovers? This section. Okay, we can move on to the next part. This is sick buyout. So this goes back to, I think, fiscal year 23. We were in the process this time last year, trying to balance the budget, and we were looking at, every nook and cranny to see if there were areas where we could reduce expenses, where the revenues couldn't increase. And we examined sick buyout pretty seriously because, the landscape has changed. COVID-19 had happened. We just wanted to see, are people using the sick buyout that we're budgeting? And we actually found that across the city, we had a lot of excess sick buyout budget for like several years going back even. That includes like before COVID-19, during COVID-19. And so we just started thinking, well, people are probably taking more sick time maybe than they used to, or they're more comfortable doing that. Maybe younger people take sick time more than people who have recently retired. So anyway, we decided to adjust the formula for the fiscal year 23 budget to just kind of reduce the amount of sick buyout budget, which would free that budget up for other areas like, you know, police, public safety, just to kind of help with that. Anyway, so then November comes along, we're just anxiously waiting to make sure like no one goes over budget with their sick buyout. And we actually found that it had been a pretty accurate formula. And so that gave us the confidence that it was good to lower the sick buyout budget. But there were a couple of divisions or departments in the general fund where people had actually not been as sick and they got more sick buyout. And so we were thinking, we like the formula, but maybe if there's a way that we can just reallocate some of the sick buyout budget across different departments that are in the general fund, then that can kind of help be that buffer for some departments if they end up using more sick buyout budget. So this provision right here would just allow the mayor or the administration to redistribute sick buyout budget authority in the general fund between departments. And it would only be for sick buyout. It would only happen once a year and just be purely based on whether a department had gone over the formula, based on the formula that we had allocated.
Can you speak to the sick day policy briefly?
Yes.
Just remind us what that is. Is it something that aggregates indefinitely, or have we moved to
it doesn't
a more common thing where it only goes for a certain amount of time? You gotta either do a buyout or you use it.
I'm pretty sure it's like you use it or you get bought out for up to 48 hours of the 96 hours that you can accrue as an employee, full-time employee. John, is that accurate? Oh, sure.
Basically what happens is if you've been with the city less than 20 years, you leave, you're eligible to get 25%. If you've been with them more than 20 years, you leave, it's standing, you're eligible by 30%. And then they have to buy out each year, which is half. So if you're not sick at all, you have the option, you actually get bought out on 50% of that.
Would the other 50% be lost?
Nope, the other 50% goes into the bank
For future use.
Future use. So if you have a big sickness or something, it's there for you, and as well as when you eventually retire or leave, based on your years of service, you get a portion of that.
So you can only accumulate at the maximum of at your year's allotment on an ongoing basis.
Yeah.
Okay.
And a couple of things that we've learned from that. Number one, it helps the city in the fact that you're doing it a lot because people's wages over time go up. And so if you do that annually, half of it, it helps that way. And then it's also been kind of a nice benefit for those employees that don't use or abuse their sick pay. And that every day you depend on them, it creates an incentive for them to be there. That's been a good thing too. Okay. Great.
So that's an additional provision that's never been in the budget ordinance before, but kind of based on what we were seeing, we thought it would be worth asking that.
And I would add one thing too. It won't be very often. We just found that in one or two or three accounts that we had issues. Like for example, I used all my sick pay last year when I had my accident, and so our sick pay buyout for that year was less because I used all of mine plus some while I was out. Somebody else, some other department may have been very healthy and not used it very much, and so I think it just helps. We can project good from a citywide perspective, but from a specific department,
it's tricky. And yeah, I forgot I had this little example here, but just like assuming like legal had $10,000 for their sick buyout budget and they actually spent $15,000, then they were like over budget by $5,000 in that category through no fault of their own. It was just what happened that year. Meanwhile, development services, if they had $30,000 in their budget, but only spent $20,000 for their sick buyout, they have some extra sick buyout budget that could help legal out in that one instance. And we would just look at that on like all the department basis. So anyway, okay, is that good? Okay, the next slide. So we met with council staff and Brian Jones just to kind of go through the Recreation Capital Facilities Fund. This has been in the budget ordinance previously, but if you remember this past year, we came to council and asked if we could use some of Parks and Recreation's carryover or budget savings from fiscal year 22 to help make up the difference of for the Recreation Capital Facility funds because they hadn't had enough as anticipated to go into that fund. And we're not going to go through all the language. John actually prepared a really useful example, I think, of how this would work operationally based on the language here. And we can go to the next slide to kind of go through what this looks like.
And this is what we already authorized with this one.
It's authorized, but there is a little bit of there's new language in there specifically giving carryover budget as an option in certain circumstances.
Right.
We'll kind of walk through like what that could look like.
Is there something we need to vote on again, or we did?
It would just be in the ordinance, and well, it's currently built into this ordinance, but if you have any concerns, then this is a good time to voice that and we can adjust. But like, for example, we have kind of budget years and then the audit here listed. And so what originally was in the ordinance was that, let's say we had $5 million for the rec center revenues and $4.5 million for rec center expenses in the budget with an anticipated surplus of about $500,000. That's kind of what we have already planned for. And then general services, we just kind of have $400,000 set aside as an option to kind of basically cover rec center transfers to the capital facilities fund if they are able to have a net income that's up to $400,000. Yes, John.
Now, just make one clarification. One of the reasons that that's important is what we wouldn't want to do is take that $500,000 surplus and go spend it on officers or other areas in the general fund. So we've just said, to be conservative, we're going to set aside 400 in general services in the event that the rec center is profitable, then we have that money to transfer to the capital fund.
It's already budgeted.
Yes.
It's already budgeted, it's already there.
And the 400,000 number originally is what we always budgeted in general services for the rec center. It was just when Parks and Rec wanted to kind of try to own, their success and contribute their own net income that we kind of adopted a new model. But that $400,000 is there in general services. So then that was the budget. We get into the actuals when we're getting audited the next year. So what ended up happening, this is just theoretical, but the rec center revenues were $4.5 million. And then the expenses were $4.6 million. So in reality, your surplus ended up being $300,000. So under the ordinance, they can transfer that $300,000 from the general fund, which is kind of because you have that budget, it helps with that. You have $300,000 that you can transfer from general fund to the Recreation Capital Facilities Fund. But we have this asterisk here because and this is kind of the newer language that is in the 24 ordinance. If the recreation center net income is less than the $400,000, then Parks and Rec has the option of using budget savings through carryover that can then help get them up to that $400,000 if they have enough. And so they have the potential still of reaching $400,000. This example down here says if they had, $200,000 in budget savings, then up to $100,000 of that could go into the capital fund. So that's one example of how that would work. And then meanwhile, because you only contributed $300,000 from the surplus out of the general services budget, we can carry over $100,000 into the next year to reduce the amount we need to budget in future years for that cost. Sorry, it's kind of a lot, but anyway, any questions about this? I have another example if we want to go through it, or we can move on.
I would just add that in the next year, there was a year 2, okay?
We can go to that. That's on the next slide.
That's on the-
Yeah,
okay.
if you want to go to that.
Anyone have a question about that? Right. Thanks, Councilman.
Yeah. I think what John was saying is in year 2, what were you gonna say, John? No, I was following you, but I forgot what
You know what? Go ahead. Here's where the character comes back in,
So,
right? The example of the carryover.
oh, yes, yeah. Sorry, I totally lost my train of thought. Here we have the budget for year 2, and then the surplus was 500. Oh, this was where we had So basically, if your net income was over $400,000 in the rec center, then they could move that full $400,000 to the rec capital fund. But beyond that, they could contribute half of it, but the other half would fall to general fund balance. And so that's why they were able to move up $450,000 that year. That kind of makes sense. It's, yeah, it's like some mental gymnastics for me on this one, but it's
So it
making
could
sense.
exceed 400 as long as they have a share of this year.
Yeah,
Yes, and in year two, because we had 100,000 that we carried over in general services, then we have another 300,000 that we budget to get it back to 400,000. So that in the next year, you would have the money to cover. See here, we actually did 450, we did 450. So the 400 would have been appropriated, and the other 50, we would just take out fund balance. That's kind of how it falls.
so that is operationally how the language in the budget ordinance would work at the end of each fiscal year. The next slide just mentioned, it shows the example of how the ice sheet and the golf course would fall into this equation. Because they're enterprise funds, we can look at their calculation differently. We can actually look at their fund balance and use that as an assessment. It's the same for both the ice sheet and the golf course, but here's an ice sheet example. Let's say in year one, we budgeted $2.4 million in the revenues. The ordinance says that 25, whoa. That's okay, this is like a cool spreadsheet. Okay, I like spreadsheets. Okay, so we get, sorry, so you budget $2.4 million for the revenues, and then 25% of that in the ordinance is eligible, is kind of your basis point for figuring out how much you can transfer. So 25% of revenues is $602,000. Meanwhile, when you get to the audit, your fund balance at the end of the year is $650,000. So you just take the fund balance and subtract the 25% of budgeted revenues to figure out how much you can transfer to the rec capital fund. That's for both golf course and ice sheet. And so basically rec center, ice sheet, golf course, they're all contributing to this rec capital fund. They're all part of triple play, and they can all kind of use each other's successes to help fund needs in all three of those areas. And so anyway, we just kind of tried to clean up some of the language and also add the carryover portion for the rec center element. So any questions? I feel like, I don't know if I explained that very well, but thank you, Kelsey. Okay.
Any more questions?
Okay, so the next part is much shorter, so we'll get to that. If you can go to the next slide. Okay, this is new language, but what we've been finding, especially, since all of the supply shortages, there have been situations where a fleet is trying to purchase vehicles, for example, and they find out that they're not, a vehicle they order today might not get here for like a year or two. And so we've run into it, not a ton, but enough that we thought we should maybe add some language in the budget ordinance that would authorize the mayor to open a purchase order in like the current fiscal year, that even though the item wouldn't actually be paid for until future fiscal years. And again, it would only be on a case-by-case basis when there are those issues with supply chain. But the ordinance would say the mayor is hereby authorized during the specific fiscal year, and we'd have to update it every year, to enter into purchase agreements for equipment or vehicles with a schedule, production, or manufacturing cycle that goes beyond the fiscal year. So any concerns with that language?
So previously that couldn't happen?
It was not authorized in the budget ordinance. And so it's been kind of the awkward, like, what do we do for this item,
What it comes from really is we've got a provision in code that says contracts that are not funded in the current year need to be approved by the council. This is basically a way of, this is giving the opportunity to the council, if they want to say that particular kind of contract is pre-authorized for the whole year.
Right. Thank you. That's great.
Okay.
Let me just give you a couple examples too. Travis in energy has been running issues with transformers where they've had to order them 2 or 3 years out.
Yeah.
And if they don't get them ordered, they'll run into a real big issue. And so what we've been doing in order to accommodate that, we've been working with the mayor's office, but we've had to go into our system, create kind of a dummy purchase order, provide it to them, and then eliminate it, but then they've got what they need. But we don't like that because that's not, I mean, it accomplished it, but we're kind of going around and we prefer to be transparent with the council. We're also running into a fire apparatus, fire trucks. They're 2 or 3 years out, so we just need to be able to do those orders and be able to keep this. And we're even running into this with some heavy duty trucks too as well.
Yeah. So, yeah. So that I think those are the changes. If you go to the next slide, I think it's just the question slide. Yeah, so those are the major changes to the budget ordinance. And if you have any concerns, let us know. Otherwise, if you decide not to do truth and taxation, then this ordinance would be available for you to vote on next week. Or if you do the truth and taxation, then it wouldn't be until August that it would be there for you to approve. So any questions?
I think that last thing is interesting, right? Because that way we're binding future council essentially, right? By allowing the mayor to enter a contract that.
Well, but you are anyway, but it's a matter of when you do it, right? Because if you don't pass this, then the alternative is that every one of those contracts gets brought to you to approve, and you're still binding the future council by approving the contract.
Yeah, it's just a really weird situation we're in with that.
I mean, in some ways, it's a weird situation when we haven't faced this particular thing before, but I mean, there's any number of situations we've had in the past where, there's a contract that, whatever it is, we're buying a service that requires payments over a 5-year period, right? And we bring those to you, and you are binding the future councils by approving those contracts because we're going to spend money for the next 5 years.
Yeah.
This is the same kind of thing, but in a different context.
Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you, Kelsey.
Thank you.
I think, don't get to the next one. Okay, presentation regarding the 2024 supplemental budget request, and this is for you, Daily.
Okay, I will say we have 5 minutes left. This went out in an email 2 weeks ago, and we can go over this, but I was just going to walk through like a summary of what they were and see if there was discussion. So I don't really have a presentation, but we can go ahead and pull up what we do have, and then I can walk through that and see if there's discussion, or we can continue this to the meeting on Tuesday since we have 5 minutes.
We have to stick to 5 minutes. We just get this done.
I mean, that's up to you.
We have a meeting that we've had on the calendar for a month.
Oh yeah, they do have the RD meeting right after. And that's been,
Well, I think we can reschedule that.
well,
We don't.
RDA meetings are quarterly and noticed, so they can keep.
It's not
Executive committee or not.
It's not a meeting of the board, right? It's just a meeting of.
Right.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
Well,
but it's up to the chair.
we were told that this meeting ended at 5,
Well, I'd rather while we're all here, just finish the whole agenda.
but we're not all here.
Well, the ones that most of us are here that we're going to do here anyway.
What do you want to do?
What was our agenda again for the meeting today?
There was,
Sorry,
there was like
sidebar.
8 things on
There were 8 things, yeah, I mean, for the board, we had many things to discuss, and,
I didn't think this meeting was happening. This was all anyway. So
it's not that it's all. And we still meet with the chair and the vice chair regardless, still meet with the director of the RDA. And Keith is leaving town tomorrow, and I'm leaving town this weekend, so if we want to get it done before this.
Okay, so next.
George has left, so he's no longer on.
yes, he went to bed.
Yeah. So we have a couple of things that we can get to today. But these are things that we will need to discuss. Is there time on the Tuesday meeting
Yeah,
for this?
the work meeting.
The work meeting? Without us starting at 9:30 in the morning?
Yeah,
Okay.
you're not gonna have a nice like 2 o'clock start time again, but it won't be like a 10:30 like we did that.
And that we've learned something about ourselves from that experience. On Tuesday, you won't be here, no. Right?
Yeah, but I can watch the meeting after.
But I really want your input on these.
So it's up to you guys. I'm,
The preference today or try to start eventually today or when it's Tuesday.
Well, it doesn't sound like either way. You're Shannon, right?
Yeah.
Either way, Shannon's not here, but Travis, you're part of this being certified.
yeah. And if they both leave, then we don't.
Yeah, Jordan will be here. Not what we want to say.
I think nobody wants to do another one of these meetings though, right? 2 weeks from now, another budget party?
Well, what's left on the agenda today? Is this it?
We have this, and then we have another item, which is tentative budget and council priorities.
Which we've heard, work meeting already, but we're just going to review again.
We want to take another half an hour, we just want another half hour, and you guys can do your meeting.
No, because he has to leave at 5:30.
Yeah, I don't want to be rushed going through these other things because I think the discussions that we had earlier were good and were entirely worthwhile and we needed to have that. And I want to be able to give that same kind of consideration to talking about these, budget priorities and things that haven't been funded and what we want to do about that, if anything.
Okay, so Malia, we can add that to Tuesday.
It would also be good to have an update about the metrics that each department was submitting.
Well, and that was, so, yeah, maybe the metrics that they did, one thing that we asked in leadership was for the administration to tell us kind of how they rank things.
They gave us that.
And they gave us that, so that will be in this
How
presentation.
they rank projects.
Right, because there were some things that were critical that they funded, some things that were critical that they did not fund, and we wanted to know how close were those things? And if we were to find more money somehow, which of the unfunded things would be their top priority, and which ones were they like, we love our department, but
Separate from that, I do want to see the metrics. Like
The
updated,
metrics
some
they
of it.
presented in their budget presentations.
But
Okay.
some of them weren't. They didn't meet the standards that Justin set forth, right? Some of them were not going to be annual metrics that could be measured against. And some of them they didn't have control over either.
I think they can address that next year, and I don't think we go over that again now, do they?
I will say we could ask, I don't know. All meeting materials are due by today by noon for next week, so I don't think if we ask now, that would be a reasonable
But
turnaround.
it's July.
We could do it later, but I don't think it would be possible on Tuesday, given some days.
I would think put that on the tracker if you want it, if there's a second on that, we can go with that. Right?
so, yeah, just a quick question, on moving these over, does this month of a notice or anything for Tuesday, are we good at this point?
No, we're good,
We're good.
Yeah, we're fine.
because we'll post on Thursday.
Okay. A closed session is not been requested. And if there's no objection, we will now adjourn the Provo Municipal Council work meeting by unanimous consent. Councilors, you'll want to turn on your mic and speak up if you object.
It is time.
Recording